Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight I'm diving into something that honestly made me nostalgic as hell while putting this together. We're reading childhood memory stories from Reddit. And let me tell you, these aren't your typical internet horror stories or relationship drama. These are the pure, innocent moments that shaped us before life got complicated. The kind of memories that make you smile without even realizing it. So grab something cozy, get comfortable, and let's take a trip back to simpler times. Trust me, you're going to want to hear every single one of these. Our first story comes from someone who discovered that sometimes the simplest moments create the most lasting magic. The swing set that touched the sky. This story comes from Lily. I remember being maybe 6 or 7 years old, standing in front of our old wooden swing set in the backyard. It was nothing fancy, just 2 weathered posts with a single swing hanging from rusty chains that squeaked whenever the wind caught them. But to me, it might as well have been a rocket ship waiting to launch me into space. My dad would come out after dinner when the light was starting to fade, still wearing his work shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He'd walk over with this gentle smile and ask if I wanted to swing. I'd already be running toward him before he finished the question, practically bouncing with excitement. The ritual was always the same. He'd lift me onto the wooden seat, making sure I had a good grip on the chains. Then he'd position himself behind me, placing his large hands on my back. "Ready for takeoff?" he'd ask in his serious pilot voice. And I'd giggle and nod so hard I thought my head might fall off. He'd start with small pushes, just enough to get me moving back and forth. But gradually, push by push, I'd go higher and higher until I was soaring through the air like I had wings. The ground would disappear beneath my feet, and for those perfect moments, I felt like I was flying. But here's the thing I remember most clearly. There was this one evening when the pushes felt different, stronger somehow. I was going higher than I'd ever gone before, and suddenly I could see over our fence, over Mrs. Peterson's garden, over the tops of the maple trees that lined our streets. For a split second, I swear I could see the whole neighborhood spread out below me like a miniature world. "Daddy, I can see everything," I shouted, my voice carried away by the wind rushing past my ears. "I'm touching the sky." I could hear him laughing behind me, that deep, warm laugh that made everything feel safe and perfect. "That's my girl," he called back. "Reach for the stars while you're up there." I stretched my arms out wide, pretending I could actually grab hold of the clouds drifting overhead. The swing carried me back and forth through the golden evening light, and I felt like nothing in the world could ever hurt me, as long as my dad was there, pushing me toward the sky. Eventually, the pushes would get gentler, and I'd slowly come back down to earth. But even when my feet touched the ground again, I'd still feel like I was floating. My dad would ruffle my hair and tell me what a brave little pilot I was, and we'd walk back to the house hand in hand, while fireflies started blinking in the grass around us. That swing set is long gone now, replaced by my mum's flower garden years ago, but I still dream about it sometimes. In my dreams, I'm still that little girl with the tangled hair and grass-stained knees, soaring higher and higher, while my dad's steady hands guide me safely through the air. And for just a moment when I wake up, I can still feel that incredible sensation of flying, of being lifted up by someone who loved me enough to help me touch the sky. That story is over. Man, there's something about the image of a dad pushing his daughter on a swing that just hits different. The way she described feeling like she could see the whole world from up there, and how safe she felt knowing her father was right behind her. Those are the moments that become the foundation of who we are. The trust, the joy, the feeling that anything is possible when someone believes in you enough to help you fly. Let's move to our next story, which takes us into the wonder of childhood discovery. This one comes from Daniel, about a moment that felt like finding actual treasure the day I found a 4-leaf clover. This story is from Daniel. I was 8 years old, spending the summer at my grandmother's house, like I did every year. Grandma lived in this tiny cottage with a wraparound porch and a backyard that seemed to stretch on forever, at least through the eyes of a kid who was used to our small apartment in the city. Her backyard was my personal adventure land. There were berry bushes I could hide behind, an old apple tree perfect for climbing, and patches of wildflowers that attracted butterflies and bees. But the thing I loved most was the massive field of clover that covered almost half her yard. It was like a soft green carpet that felt amazing under bare feet, and it was where I spent most of my lazy summer afternoons. I'd heard the stories about four-leaf clovers from other kids at school, how they were supposed to be incredibly rare and bring you good luck if you found one. Most of my friends claimed they'd found dozens, but I was pretty sure they were lying because I'd been looking through clover patches for years and had never even seen one that looked close. This particular day was hot and humid, the kind of summer afternoon where even the birds seemed too tired to sing. I was lying on my stomach in the clover field, picking dandelions and making chains out of them, while Grandma worked in her vegetable garden nearby. I could hear her humming old songs under her breath as she watered her tomatoes. I was just mindlessly running my hands through the clover, enjoying the cool feeling of the leaves against my palm, when something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just the way the light was hitting one particular plant, making it look different from the others, but when I looked closer, my heart actually stopped. There, nestled between two perfectly normal three-leaf clovers, was the most beautiful four-leaf clover I'd ever seen. Not that I'd seen any before, but this one was absolutely perfect. Each leaf was the same size, bright green and healthy, arranged in a perfect cross pattern that seemed almost too symmetrical to be real. I must have stared at it for a full minute, afraid to touch it in case it disappeared or turned out to be just two three-leaf clovers growing close together. But no, it was definitely real. 4 distinct leaves growing from one single stem, just like in the pictures I'd seen in books. "Grandma!" I shouted, my voice cracking with excitement. "Grandma, come quick, you have to see this." She dropped her watering can and hurried over, probably thinking I'd been stung by a bee or something, but when I pointed to the clover, her whole face lit up with the biggest smile I'd ever seen. "Well, I'll be," she said, kneeling down beside me in the grass. "In all my 73 years, I don't think I've ever seen a more perfect four-leaf clover. You've got quite the eye, young man." She helped me carefully pick it, making sure we got the whole stem without damaging any of the leaves. Then we went inside where she showed me how to press it between the pages of her old dictionary, right between the words hope and horizon. She said it was important to keep it somewhere meaningful, somewhere that would help the luck grow stronger over time. That clover stayed in that dictionary for the rest of the summer, and every few days I'd sneak it out to look at it again, making sure it was still there and still as perfect as the day I found it. When it was time to go back to the city, Grandma let me take the dictionary with me so I could keep my lucky clover safe. I'm 26 now, and I still have that dictionary on my bookshelf. The clover is brown and fragile now, but it's still there between hope and horizon, exactly where we put it all those years ago. And you know what? I do think it brought me luck. Not the magical kind where everything goes perfectly, but the kind of quiet, steady luck that comes from knowing someone believed your childhood wonder was worth preserving. Every time I see that old book, I remember the feeling of finding something truly special in an ordinary summer afternoon, and the way my grandmother's eyes sparkled when she realised she was witnessing a moment of pure childhood magic. That story's over. There's something so beautiful about the way kids can find magic in the simplest discoveries. Daniel finding that perfect four-leaf clover wasn't just about luck. It was about his grandmother recognising the importance of that moment and helping him preserve it. The detail about pressing it between hope and horizon is just poetry. Sometimes the most precious treasures are the ones that cost nothing but mean everything. Our next story takes us into the realm of childhood creativity, where furniture becomes architecture and imagination builds kingdoms. The blanket fort that became a castle. This story comes from Mia. I was maybe 9 years old and my little brother Jake was 6. It was one of those endless Saturday afternoons where we'd already burned through cartoons, video games, and every toy in our rooms. Mom was doing laundry and Dad was outside mowing the lawn, so we were left to our own devices in the living room. That's when Jake had what he called his brilliant idea. He wanted to build a fort, but not just any fort. He wanted to build the biggest, most amazing fort that had ever existed in the history of forts. I rolled my eyes at first because Jake's brilliant ideas usually ended up with someone crying or something getting broken, but I was bored enough to go along with it. We started small, just draping one of Mum's old sheets over the coffee table. But then Jake insisted we needed more space, so we moved the dining room chairs into a circle and connected them with another sheet. Before we knew it, we were raiding the entire linen closet, pulling out every sheet, blanket, and towel we could find. Mum came downstairs with a basket of clean clothes and found us in the middle of our construction project. The living room looked like a fabric store had exploded. There were sheets draped from the couch to the bookshelf, blankets stretched between chair backs, and pillowcases clipped to lampshades with clothespins we'd stolen from the laundry room. Instead of telling us to clean it up like I expected, Mum just stood there with this amazed look on her face. "What are you two building?" she asked. "It's going to be a castle," Jake announced proudly, his hair sticking up from crawling around under all the fabric. "With different rooms and everything. Mia's going to be the queen, and I'm going to be the brave knight who protects it." Mum set down her laundry basket and actually started helping us. She showed us how to use binder clips to hold the sheets tighter, and she brought us some rope from the garage to tie around the chair legs for extra support. Dad came in from mowing, and instead of complaining about the chaos, he helped us move the heavy furniture so we could expand our castle even further. By the time we were done, our fort stretched from the living room into the dining room and even had a little annex in the hallway. We'd created separate chambers using different coloured sheets, and we'd designated specific areas for different purposes. There was the throne room where I held court, the armoury where Jake kept his plastic swords, the library where we stacked all our favourite books, and even a dungeon in the space under the stairs. We spent the entire rest of the day in that castle. We ate lunch sitting cross-legged on pillows in the Great Hall, with sandwiches that Mum passed through one of our window flaps. We told stories by flashlight, planned elaborate adventures, and pretended we were ruling over a magical kingdom where anything was possible. When it started getting dark, Dad poked his head through the main entrance and asked if the royal family would like some pizza for dinner. We ate it in our throne room, while watching a movie on the laptop, the screen casting weird shadows on the sheet walls around us. I remember falling asleep that night in the castle, curled up next to Jake on a pile of cushions we'd pulled off the couch. I woke up the next morning in my own bed, and when I went downstairs, the living room was back to normal. All the sheets were folded and put away. The furniture was in its proper place, and there was no sign that our magical kingdom had ever existed. But for one perfect day, Jake and I had been royalty in our own castle, and our parents had been willing subjects who helped us build our dreams out of bedsheets and imagination. Sometimes, I think that was the last time Jake and I really played together like that, before we got too old and too cool for make-believe. But I'll never forget the feeling of crawling through those fabric corridors, knowing that we'd created something amazing out of nothing more than creativity and old linens. That story is over. There's something so pure about sibling creativity when it actually works instead of ending in tears. The way their parents not only allowed the chaos but actively helped them build their dream castle shows the kind of parenting that creates these golden memories. You can almost smell the fabric softener and feel the excitement of having your own secret world right in the middle of the house. Let's move to our next story about a milestone moment that every kid dreams of achieving. The first time I rode my bike without training wheels. This story comes from Jonah. I was 7 years old and absolutely convinced that I was the only kid in my entire second grade class who still needed training wheels. Every day after school, I'd watch the other kids zoom around the playground on their bikes, doing sharp turns and racing each other while I wobbled along slowly with my embarrassing little support wheels spinning uselessly beside me. My mum had been promising for weeks that we'd take the training wheels off when I was ready, but every time we talked about it, I'd get scared and change the subject. The thing is, those training wheels felt safe. They meant I couldn't fall, couldn't get hurt, couldn't fail in front of everyone. But they also meant I couldn't really fly. The decision finally happened on a random Thursday evening in June. I'd had another embarrassing day at school where Tommy Martinez had made fun of my baby bike during recess, and I came home determined to prove him wrong. I marched into the garage where Mum was organising some boxes and announced that I was ready to be a real bike rider. She looked surprised but didn't question my sudden burst of confidence. She found Dad's toolbox and spent about 10 minutes unscrewing the training wheels while I stood there watching, my stomach doing nervous flips with every turn of the wrench. When she lifted those wheels away from my bike, it looked completely different. Suddenly it looked fast and dangerous and impossibly tall. "You sure about this, buddy?" Mum asked, probably noticing how pale I'd gotten. I nodded even though I wasn't sure about anything. We wheeled the bike out to the sidewalk in front of our house, and Mum explained the plan. She was going to hold on to the back of my seat while I pedalled, running alongside me to keep me steady. When I felt balanced and confident, I was supposed to tell her, and she'd let go. The first few attempts were disasters. I'd start pedalling, and the bike would immediately veer to one side or the other. My knuckles were white from gripping the handlebars so tight, and I kept hitting the brakes every few seconds because I was convinced I was about to crash. Mum was incredibly patient, jogging next to me and offering constant encouragement. "You're doing great, Jonah. Keep your eyes looking ahead, not down at the ground. Trust the bike, it wants to stay upright." After about 20 minutes of wobbling and stopping and starting again, something clicked. I was pedalling down the sidewalk, and suddenly it felt smooth. The bike wasn't fighting me anymore. It was working with me. The handlebars felt steady in my hands, and I could feel the momentum carrying me forward. "I think I've got it," I called back to Mum, my voice shaky with excitement. "You definitely do," she called back. "Keep going." I pedalled faster, feeling more confident with every turn of the wheels. The summer air was rushing past my face, and I felt like I was flying down that sidewalk. I made it all the way to the corner before I realised something incredible. I couldn't hear Mum's footsteps behind me anymore. I turned around and saw her standing about 50 feet back, her hands on her hips, and the biggest smile I'd ever seen on her face. She'd let go without telling me, and I'd been riding completely on my own for almost half a block. "Mum, did you see that?" I shouted, so excited I nearly lost my balance. "I did it! I actually did it!" She jogged over to where I'd stopped and scooped me up in the biggest hug, bike and all. "I'm so proud of you," she said, and I could hear that she was crying a little bit. "You looked like a natural out there." I spent the rest of that evening riding up and down our street, getting braver with each lap. I practiced turning corners, riding with one hand, and even standing up on the pedals like the older kids did. Every neighbour who was outside stopped to cheer for me, and Mrs. Henderson from next door brought out her camera to take pictures. When it finally got too dark to ride safely, I didn't want to go inside. I wanted to keep riding forever, to hold on to that feeling of freedom and accomplishment and pure joy. But Mum promised we'd go on a longer ride the next day, maybe even to the park a few blocks away. That night, I could barely sleep. I kept replaying that moment when I realised Mum had let go, when I understood that I was really, truly flying on my own. It was the first time in my life I remember feeling genuinely proud of myself, like I'd conquered something that had seemed impossible just a few hours earlier. The next morning at school, I couldn't wait to tell Tommy Martinez that I was officially a real bike rider now. And you know what? He actually seemed impressed, but honestly, his opinion didn't matter as much anymore. I knew what I was capable of, and that feeling was better than any approval from the playground bullies. That story is over. The moment when a parent lets go and you realise you're flying solo is probably one of the most universal childhood experiences, but it never gets old hearing about it. The way Jonah described feeling the bike work with him instead of against him perfectly captures that magical shift when something difficult suddenly clicks. And his mum crying while watching him succeed just hits you right in the heart. Our next story takes us into the warm, sweet world of grandmother's kitchens and the treasures they hold. The cookie jar on grandma's counter. This story comes from Sophie. My grandmother's kitchen was the heart of her entire house, and the heart of that kitchen was an enormous ceramic cookie jar, shaped like a fat, happy pig. It sat on the counter next to the window, where the afternoon sunlight would hit it just right and make the glaze shimmer like it was magical. That pig wasn't just decorative. It was always, and I mean always, filled with the most incredible homemade cookies you could imagine. Chocolate chip, oatmeal raisin, sugar cookies with colourful sprinkles, snickerdoodles dusted with cinnamon sugar. Grandma seemed to have an endless supply, like she had some secret cookie factory hidden in her basement. I was probably 5 or 6 when I became completely obsessed with that cookie jar. Every time we visited Grandma's house, the first thing I'd do after hugging her hello was make a beeline for the kitchen. I'd stand on my tiptoes, reaching up toward that pig, but I was never quite tall enough to lift the heavy ceramic lid on my own. That's where the ritual came in. I'd look at Grandma with my most pitiful expression and ask, "Grandma, may I please have a cookie?" And she'd pretend to think about it very seriously, tapping her finger against her chin like she was making the most important decision in the world. "Well, I suppose one cookie wouldn't hurt," she'd say with a wink. Then she'd lift me up so I could reach the jar myself. The lid was heavy and awkward for my little hands, but she'd help me guide it off safely. The sound that lid made when it came off is something I can still hear perfectly in my mind. It was this soft, hollow ceramic clink that meant magic was about to happen. But even better than the sound was the smell that would escape from inside that jar. It was like pure happiness, in the form of sugar and butter and vanilla, warm and sweet and comforting. I'd peer inside like I was looking into a treasure chest, even though I knew exactly what would be there. The cookies were always arranged so carefully, like Grandma had positioned each one just so. She'd let me pick whichever one called to me, and I'd take forever making my decision, because I wanted to choose the absolutely perfect cookie. But here's the thing I remember most clearly. After I'd made my selection and was sitting at her kitchen table, enjoying my treat, Grandma would always put the lid back on the jar with this particular care. She'd position it just right, making sure it was centered and secure. Then she'd pat the pig's ceramic head twice, like she was saying, "Thank you for keeping her cookies safe." Years later, when I was old enough to help with the baking, I learned that Grandma made fresh batches of cookies at least twice a week. She'd spend entire mornings in that kitchen, measuring ingredients and rolling dough and timing batches in the oven. The house would smell like a bakery, and she'd hum old songs while she worked. "Why do you always keep the jar so full?" I asked her once when I was helping her transfer a fresh batch of chocolate chip cookies from the cooling rack. She smiled and started arranging the new cookies in the jar with the same careful attention she always gave them. "Because you never know when someone might need a little sweetness in their day," she said. "A full cookie jar means there's always enough love to go around." I didn't really understand what she meant then, but I do now. That cookie jar wasn't just about the cookies themselves. It was about the ritual, the anticipation, the feeling of being special and cared for. It was about having a place where sweetness was always available, where love was stored up and ready to be shared. Grandma passed away when I was in college, and I inherited that ceramic pig. It sits on my kitchen counter now, in the same spot where the afternoon light hits it just right. I keep it filled with homemade cookies, just like she did, and whenever my nieces and nephews visit, we perform the same ritual. I lift them up, they choose their perfect cookie, and I pat the pig's head twice when we put the lid back on. Sometimes I catch myself humming the same old songs Grandma used to hum while she baked, and I swear I can still smell that perfect combination of sugar and love that always seemed to float through her kitchen. That cookie jar connects me to her every single day, reminding me that the simplest gestures can create the most lasting memories. That story's over. There's something so profound about how food becomes love in grandmother's hands, and how a simple cookie jar can hold decades of care and tradition. Sophie carrying on the ritual with her own nieces and nephews, shows how these beautiful customs get passed down, one ceramic pig and one perfect cookie at a time. The detail about patting the jar's head twice is just perfection. Let's move to our next story, which takes us under an endless canopy of stars and childhood wonder. The night I fell asleep under the stars. This story comes from Alex. I was 10 years old, and my cousins Jake and Emma were visiting for the week during summer vacation. Jake was 11, Emma was 9, and together we formed this unstoppable trio of mischief and adventure. My parents had been talking about letting us camp in the backyard for months, but something always seemed to come up. Either the weather wasn't right, or there was too much going on, or they just weren't ready to trust us with that kind of independence. But this particular Saturday, everything aligned perfectly. The weather forecast promised a clear, warm night with no chance of rain. My dad had just finished mowing the lawn, so the backyard looked neat and inviting. Most importantly, my mum was in one of her adventurous moods, the kind where she'd surprise us with ideas that seemed impossibly grown up and exciting. "Who wants to sleep under the stars tonight?" she asked during lunch, and the three of us practically jumped out of our chairs with excitement. We spent the entire afternoon preparing for our big adventure. Dad helped us drag sleeping bags and pillows out to the middle of the yard, far enough from the house to feel wild, but close enough that we could run inside if we got scared. Mum packed us a cooler full of snacks and juice boxes, plus a thermos of hot chocolate for later when the temperature dropped. We set up our campsite like we were real explorers heading into uncharted territory. We arranged our sleeping bags in a triangle so we could see each other's faces while we talked, and we positioned the cooler within arm's reach because we knew we'd be hungry. Dad brought out a flashlight for each of us, the heavy-duty kind that could probably be seen from space. As the sun started setting, we felt like the luckiest kids in the world. We were having our very own camping adventure without having to leave home, and we had the whole night stretched out ahead of us, with no bedtime, no parents telling us to be quiet, and no rules except to stay in the backyard. The first few hours were exactly what you'd expect from three kids let loose with flashlights and freedom. We told ghost stories that made us shiver. Even though it was a warm night, we played games like 20 questions and Would You Rather until we ran out of good scenarios. We ate way too many snacks and drank so much juice that we had to take turns sneaking into the house to use the bathroom. But as it got later and the neighbourhood grew quiet, something magical started happening. The city lights seemed to dim, and suddenly the sky above us came alive with more stars than I'd ever noticed before. It was like someone had turned up the brightness on the whole universe. We lay on our backs with our heads together, staring up at that incredible display. Emma, who was always good at school, started pointing out constellations she recognised. The Big Dipper, Orion's Belt, Cassiopeia, shaped like a W. Jake, made up his own constellations, with elaborate stories about warrior princesses and dragon slayers. "Look how many there are," I whispered, my voice small in the vastness of the night. "Do you think there are people on planets around those stars looking back at us right now?" We talked about space and aliens and whether we'd ever be brave enough to be astronauts. We wondered what it would be like to travel between stars and whether we'd remember each other when we were old and grown up. The conversation drifted from deep philosophical questions to silly jokes, and back again, the way it does when you're tired but don't want the night to end. Somewhere around midnight, our voices started getting quieter, and the gaps between sentences got longer. The crickets were chirping their summer song, and a gentle breeze was rustling through the trees around our yard. The air smelled like grass and honeysuckle, and that particular scent of night that you can't quite describe, but never forget. I remember fighting to keep my eyes open, because I didn't want to miss a single moment of this perfect night. But gradually, the combination of fresh air and excitement and the comfort of having my favourite people right beside me started winning the battle against my determination to stay awake. The last thing I remember clearly was Emma whispering something about a shooting star, Though I was too sleepy to open my eyes and look, I fell asleep to the sound of my cousins breathing softly beside me and the vast, silent presence of all those stars watching over us like ancient guardians. I woke up the next morning in my own bed, carried inside sometime during the night by parents who didn't want us catching cold in the dew. But for those few hours I'd slept under the infinite sky with two of my favourite people in the world, and it felt like we'd shared something sacred and unrepeatable. Even now, whenever I see a really clear night sky, I'm transported back to that backyard adventure. I remember the feeling of being so small under all those stars, but also somehow connected to something enormous and wonderful. It was the kind of night that makes you believe in magic and possibility and the incredible gift of being young enough to sleep under the sky without worrying about anything except which constellation to look at next. That story is over. There's something so beautiful about the way childhood friendships can turn an ordinary backyard into the centre of the universe. The image of three kids lying with their heads together, making up constellations and pondering the mysteries of space, captures that perfect blend of wonder and intimacy that makes childhood so magical. You can almost feel the grass beneath them and see those countless stars stretching endlessly overhead. Our next story brings us into the world of childhood treasures and the objects that become our lucky charms. The toy car that went everywhere with me. This story comes from Noah. I was probably 4 or 5 years old when I found it tucked behind a couch cushion at my aunt's house. It was just a simple die-cast car, maybe 3 inches long, painted bright red with tiny black racing stripes down the sides. The paint was chipped in places, and one of the wheels was slightly bent. But to me, it was absolutely perfect. I have no idea where that little car originally came from. My aunt said it had been there when she moved into the house, left behind by the previous owners, but the moment I spotted it wedged between those cushions, I knew it belonged with me. Something about its weight in my small palm, the way the metal felt cool and solid, made it seem special in a way I couldn't explain. My mum tried to convince me to leave it at my aunt's house, but I started crying so hard that she finally gave in and let me take it home. From that day forward, that little red car went absolutely everywhere with me. And I mean everywhere. I kept it in my pocket during preschool, rolling it along the edges of tables when the teacher wasn't looking. I brought it to grocery stores and pushed it along the shelves while my mum shopped. During church services, I'd quietly drive it across the wooden pew, making tiny engine sounds under my breath that probably annoyed everyone around us. The car came with me to doctor appointments, where I'd race it up and down the examination table while waiting for shots. It accompanied me to restaurants where it would sit next to my plate like a tiny dining companion. When we went to visit relatives, the car would peek out of my pocket, ready for adventures in unfamiliar houses. But it wasn't just about having a toy with me all the time. That little car felt like a talisman, like it carried some kind of protective magic that kept me safe and brave. When I had to do something scary, like talk to a new kid at the playground or go to the dentist, I'd reach into my pocket and feel its familiar shape, and somehow everything seemed manageable. I developed elaborate rituals around that car. Every morning, I'd give it 3 quick pushes across my nightstand before putting it in my pocket. I was convinced this daily ritual charged up its luck for the day ahead. If I forgot the morning ritual, I'd worry all day that something bad might happen. The car also became part of my bedtime routine. I'd drive it around the covers while my mum read me stories, parking it carefully on my nightstand when it was time to sleep. I was absolutely certain that it stood guard over me during the night, protecting me from monsters and bad dreams. My parents probably thought I'd outgrow my attachment to that little red car. But months turned into years, and I still carried it everywhere. The paint wore away even more from constant handling, and the wheels got looser, but I loved it more with every imperfection. Each new chip and scratch was like a badge of honour, proof of all the adventures we'd shared together. The car came with me on family vacations, where it would ride shotgun in rental cars and explore hotel rooms. It visited beaches and mountains, amusement parks and museums. I'd take pictures of it sitting on famous landmarks, like it was documenting its own travels. My photo albums from that time are full of landscapes with a tiny red car positioned carefully in the foreground. When I started kindergarten, I had to be more sneaky about bringing it to school. The teacher had a no toys policy, but I couldn't imagine facing a whole day without my lucky car. I'd keep it deep in my pocket and only touch it when I needed courage. Like during reading time when I had to read aloud in front of the class. One day in first grade, disaster struck. I was playing at recess when I realised my pocket felt wrong. I reached in frantically, but the car was gone. I retraced my steps across the entire playground, checking under swings and searching through the mulch around the jungle gym. My teacher helped me look, and even some of my classmates joined the search, but we never found it. I was devastated. I cried for days, convinced that I'd lost not just a toy, but my source of protection and luck. My parents tried to replace it with other cars, shinier and newer ones, but none of them felt right. They didn't have the weight, or the history, or the magic of my original red car. Eventually, I learned to be brave without it. I discovered that the confidence I'd thought came from the car had actually been inside me all along. But even now, as an adult, I still notice red cars on the street and remember the feeling of having that perfect talisman in my pocket. Sometimes I wonder if some other kid found it on that playground and felt the same instant connection I had. I hope so. That story is over. There's something so pure about childhood talismans and the way kids can imbue ordinary objects with extraordinary meaning. The image of Noah giving his car 3 pushes every morning, like he's charging up its luck, is just perfect. These childhood rituals feel so important when we're little, and maybe they actually are important because they teach us that we have the power to create our own sense of safety and magic. Our next story takes us into the joy of summer storms and the way rain can transform an ordinary day into an adventure. The rainstorm that turned into a game. This story comes from Emma. I was 7 years old, living in a neighbourhood where all the kids played together like one big extended family. It was the middle of July, one of those sweltering summer afternoons where the air feels thick enough to swim through, and even the birds seemed too hot to sing. My friends and I had been complaining about being bored for what felt like hours. We'd already exhausted all our usual activities, the playground equipment was too hot to touch, nobody wanted to ride bikes in the blazing sun, and our parents had banned us from running through sprinklers because of water restrictions. We were sprawled across my family's front porch, dramatically declaring that this was officially the most boring day in the history of summer vacation. That's when the clouds started rolling in. At first, they were just these distant, puffy white things on the horizon, but gradually they grew darker and more impressive. The air began to feel different, charged with electricity and possibility. A cool breeze picked up, the first relief we'd felt from the heat all day. My mum came outside to bring in the laundry she'd hung on the line that morning. "Looks like we might get some rain," she said, glancing up at the increasingly dramatic sky. "You kids should probably head inside soon." But instead of being disappointed about having to go indoors, we were suddenly excited. Rain meant something different was about to happen, something that might break up the monotony of another sweating, boring afternoon. We decided to wait it out on the porch, watching the storm approach like our own personal weather show. The first drops were huge and scattered, making dark spots on the hot concrete that dried up almost immediately. But within minutes, those scattered drops became a proper drizzle, then a steady shower, then an absolute downpour that came down so hard we could barely see across the street. That's when my neighbour Tommy, who was 8 and always the ringleader of our group, jumped up from the porch steps with a wild grin on his face. "Who wants to go dancing in the rain?" he shouted over the sound of water drumming on the roof. Without waiting for an answer, he ran straight out into the storm, arms spread wide like he was trying to hug the entire sky. The rest of us stared for about 2 seconds before the infectious joy of his rebellion hit us. One by one, we abandoned the safety of the porch and ran screaming into the deluge. The rain was shockingly cold against our overheated skin, and it soaked through our clothes instantly. But instead of being miserable, we were absolutely ecstatic. We'd discovered something magical that adults seem to have forgotten. Rain is just outdoor water play that falls from the sky for free. We invented games on the spot. We played tag in the downpour, slipping and sliding on the wet grass. We had competitions to see who could catch the most raindrops in their mouth, tilting our faces up toward the sky with our tongues sticking out. We pretended we were explorers discovering a new world where water fell upside down. The street quickly flooded with several inches of rushing water, and suddenly we had our own personal river system running right through the neighborhood. We raced paper boats made from leaves down the improvised streams. We built dams out of rocks and sticks, then watched the water find new paths around our constructions. Our parents appeared on their respective porches, and I was sure we were about to get in trouble for getting completely drenched. But instead of scolding us, they just stood there watching with these amazed smiles on their faces. A few of them even came outside to join us, kicking off their shoes and splashing through the puddles like they remembered something wonderful they'd forgotten about being alive. My dad grabbed my hands, and we spun around in circles in the middle of our flooded front yard, both of us laughing so hard we could barely breathe. Water was streaming down our faces, our clothes were plastered to our bodies, and we probably looked absolutely ridiculous. But it was one of those perfect moments where nothing else in the world mattered except the pure joy of being exactly where we were. The storm lasted for maybe an hour, but it felt both eternal and over too quickly. When the rain finally stopped and the sun came out, everything looked clean and fresh and new. The air smelled like wet earth and growing things, and steam was rising from the hot pavement in ghostly wisps. We were all completely soaked, covered in grass stains, and probably tracking mud everywhere we went. But we felt like we'd discovered the secret to happiness. Sometimes the best adventures happen when you stop trying to stay dry and comfortable and just let yourself get completely, joyfully drenched. That afternoon taught me that boredom isn't about having nothing to do. It's about forgetting how to see the magic that's always available if you're willing to get a little wet. Every time it rains now, I remember the feeling of dancing in that summer storm and the way my dad's laugh sounded mixing with the thunder overhead. That story is over. Kids have this incredible ability to turn weather into entertainment, and Emma's story perfectly captures that magical moment when a summer storm becomes the best day ever. The image of parents abandoning their porches to join their kids in the rain shows how these spontaneous moments of joy can be contagious across generations. Sometimes the best childhood memories come from the moments when we stop trying to stay clean and dry and just embrace the beautiful chaos of being young. Let's move to our next story about the kind of faithful companion that makes childhood feel safe and magical. The dog who waited for me after school. This story comes from Ethan. His name was Buddy, and he was the most beautiful golden retriever in the entire world, at least according to my 8-year-old assessment. He had this thick, honey-coloured coat that always seemed to catch the sunlight perfectly, and these warm brown eyes that looked at you like you were the most important person he'd ever met. Buddy had been part of our family since before I was born, which made him seem ancient and wise to me, like a furry grandfather who understood everything about life, but chose to communicate through tail wags and gentle nudges. My parents always said he'd been waiting his whole life for a kid to take care of, and when I came along he'd finally found his purpose. Every morning, Buddy would walk with me to the bus stop at the end of our street. He'd sit patiently while I waited with the other kids, his tail sweeping back and forth across the sidewalk like a golden broom. When the big yellow school bus rounded the corner, he'd stand up and give me one last encouraging nudge with his nose, like he was saying, "Go learn things, I'll be here when you get back." But here's the thing that made Buddy extraordinary. Every single afternoon, without fail, he'd be waiting for me at our front gate when I came home from school. Not just waiting, but actively watching for me. I'd round the corner onto our street, and there he'd be, sitting perfectly upright with his ears perked forward, scanning every kid getting off every bus until he spotted me. The moment he saw me, his entire body would start wiggling with excitement. His tail would go into overdrive, beating against the gate post like a drum. He'd start making these little whimpering sounds of pure joy, like he'd been worried all day that maybe this time I wouldn't come back. And now he could finally relax because his favourite person was home safe. I'd run toward him, dropping my backpack somewhere along the way, and he'd press his nose through the chain-link fence to greet me. The second I opened that gate, he'd launch himself at me with so much enthusiasm that I'd usually end up knocked over in the grass, laughing while he covered my face with slobbery kisses. My mum told me that Buddy would start his vigil around 2 o'clock every afternoon, about an hour before school let out. He'd position himself by the gate and just wait, watching every car that passed and perking up hopefully whenever he heard children's voices in the distance, rain or shine, hot or cold. He'd be there when I needed him. On days when I'd had a rough time at school, when some kid had been mean to me, or I'd gotten a bad grade on a test, Buddy seemed to sense it immediately. He'd skip his usual exuberant greeting and instead just lean against me quietly, offering the kind of wordless comfort that only dogs really understand how to give. We'd sit together on the front steps and he'd rest his head on my lap while I told him about my day. Buddy was my walking companion, my confidant, and my personal entertainment system all rolled into one perfect package. After snack time, we'd explore our neighbourhood together. He'd chase butterflies while I rode my bike, always staying close enough that I felt protected, but far enough ahead that it seemed like we were both on our own individual adventures. He was patient with all my childhood experiments and games. When I decided I wanted to teach him to play hide and seek, he'd actually close his eyes and count to 10 in dog years, which I was convinced was much faster than human counting. When I set up elaborate obstacle courses in the backyard, he'd humour me by jumping over broomsticks and crawling under lawn chairs, even though he clearly thought the whole thing was ridiculous. The best part about having Buddy was the way he made me feel important and needed. I was responsible for filling his water bowl, helping brush his coat, and making sure he got enough exercise. He made me feel like I had a job that mattered, like someone was counting on me to take care of them. It was my first real experience with unconditional love that went both ways. Buddy lived to be 14, which is pretty old for a golden retriever. Toward the end, he couldn't make it out to the gate anymore, but he'd still wait for me by the front window, his tail thumping against the glass when he saw me coming up the walk. Even when arthritis made it hard for him to move around, he never stopped being excited to see me come home. When we finally had to say goodbye to him, I felt like I was losing not just a pet, but my first real best friend. The house felt impossibly quiet without the sound of his tail hitting furniture and his gentle snoring at the foot of my bed. But I also felt incredibly lucky to have had 8 years with someone who thought I was worth waiting for every single day. Even now, whenever I come home to visit my parents, I still feel a little surprised when there's no golden shape waiting by the gate. Buddy taught me that love is showing up consistently, being excited about the people you care about, and never taking for granted the simple joy of someone coming home to you. That story is over. The loyalty of a childhood dog is something that stays with you forever, and Ethan's description of Buddy waiting at the gate every single day just melts your heart. Dogs have this incredible ability to make kids feel like the centre of the universe, and that kind of unconditional love becomes a template for what relationships should feel like. The image of Buddy starting his vigil an hour early, just in case, perfectly captures that pure devotion that only dogs seem capable of. Our next story brings us to the peaceful art of making stones dance across water. The first time I learned to skip rocks, this story comes from Clara. I was 9 years old, spending a week at my Uncle David's cabin on Lake Minnetonka. Uncle David was my mum's younger brother, and he had this relaxed, patient way about him that made everything seem possible and unhurried. He was the kind of adult who remembered what it felt like to be a kid, and he never made you feel silly for asking questions or wanting to try impossible things. The cabin sat right on the water's edge, with a small wooden dock that stretched out into the lake, like a finger pointing toward adventure. The shoreline was perfect for rock collecting, covered with thousands of smooth stones that had been polished by years of gentle waves. I'd spent most of the week gathering what I thought were the most beautiful specimens, arranging them in careful piles by size and colour. It was our last evening there, and the lake was completely calm, like a giant mirror reflecting the pink and orange sunset clouds. Uncle David and I were sitting on the end of the dock, with our feet dangling in the cool water, just enjoying the peaceful quiet of the evening. That's when he picked up a flat, smooth stone from the pile beside us and held it up to catch the fading light. "Want to learn something magical?" he asked, with that mischievous grin that meant he was about to teach me something wonderful. I nodded eagerly, always ready for whatever Uncle David had in mind. He stood up and demonstrated the proper stance, showing me how to hold the stone between my thumb and index finger, how to position my body sideways to the water, and how to keep my arm parallel to the surface of the lake. "The secret," he explained, "is all in the wrist and the angle. You want the stone to hit the water as flat as possible, and you need to give it plenty of spin. Watch this." He drew his arm back and released the stone with a smooth, practiced motion. I watched in amazement as it hit the water and bounced, then bounced again and again and again. I counted 7 perfect skips before it finally sank beneath the surface, leaving behind a series of expanding ripples that caught the sunset light like liquid gold. "How did you do that?" I gasped, already reaching for another stone. "Practice and patience," Uncle David said, settling back down beside me. "And choosing the right rocks. You want them flat and smooth, about the size of your palm. Too big, and they're too heavy. Too small, and they don't have enough momentum." We spent the next hour working on my technique. My first attempts were spectacular failures. I'd throw the stones too hard or at the wrong angle, and they'd just plop into the water, with disappointing splashes. But Uncle David never got frustrated or impatient. He'd just hand me another stone and offer gentle corrections. "Try holding it a little looser," he'd suggest. "Let the stone do the work, don't force it, and remember to follow through with your wrist, like you're trying to shake hands with the water." Gradually, I started getting the feel for it. My stones began to skip once, then twice. Each small success felt like a major victory, and Uncle David would cheer like I'd just won the Olympics. The sun was getting lower, painting the entire lake in shades of gold and crimson, and I was completely absorbed in the rhythm of selecting stones, winding up and releasing. Then it happened. I picked up a perfectly flat piece of grey slate, positioned myself just like Uncle David had taught me, and let it fly. The stone hit the water at the perfect angle and began to dance across the surface like it was alive. 1 skip, 2 skips, 3, 4, 5 beautiful bounces before it finally surrendered to the lake. I let out a whoop of pure joy and jumped up and down on the dock so enthusiastically that I nearly fell in. Uncle David was laughing and clapping, and he grabbed me in a huge congratulatory hug that lifted me right off my feet. "That was absolutely perfect," he said. "You're a natural rock skipper, Clara. I'm officially impressed." We stayed out there until it was almost too dark to see the stones hit the water, taking turns and trying to beat each other's records. Uncle David told me stories about learning to skip rocks with his grandfather when he was my age, and how they used to have contests to see who could get the most skips out of a single stone. That night, I fell asleep, listening to the gentle sound of waves lapping against the dock, my arm pleasantly sore from throwing stones and my heart full of the satisfaction that comes from mastering something new. I dreamed about stones dancing across endless water, bouncing toward horizons I could barely imagine. Even now, whenever I'm near a body of water with a rocky shore, I automatically start scanning for the perfect skipping stones. The muscle memory is still there, that specific wrist motion that Uncle David taught me on that perfect evening. And every successful skip takes me back to that dock, to the feeling of learning something magical from someone who cared enough to teach me patience and the joy of simple perfection. That story is over. There's something timeless about the art of skipping stones, and Clara's story captures that perfect moment when practice finally pays off and the impossible becomes possible. Uncle David sounds like the kind of adult every kid needs in their life, someone who takes the time to teach you that magic is just skill plus patience plus the right flat rock. The image of them staying out until dark, taking turns and sharing stories, is just beautiful. Our next story takes us into the sweet soundtrack of summer childhood. The ice cream truck song. This story comes from Jacob. The sound is burned into my memory so clearly that I can still hum every note perfectly 20 years later. It was this tinkling, slightly off-key melody that seemed to float through the air like musical magic, growing louder and more urgent as it approached our neighbourhood. I was 6 years old, and summer meant freedom from school, endless days of playing outside and the daily anticipation of that familiar song drifting down our street. The ice cream truck would make its rounds every afternoon around 3 o'clock, and I swear I developed supernatural hearing specifically for detecting those first faint notes from blocks away. Our house was positioned perfectly in the middle of a long residential street, which meant I had a good 3 or 4 minutes of warning before the truck would actually reach us. The moment I heard that song beginning to echo off the houses in the distance, I'd drop whatever I was doing and start the elaborate process of securing ice cream funding. "Mum! Mum! The ice cream truck is coming!" I'd shout, bursting through the screen door like the house was on fire. "Can I have $1? Please, it's getting closer." My mum would usually be in the kitchen or folding laundry, and she'd give me this patient smile that said she'd been through this exact routine every day for weeks. She'd reach into her purse and pull out a crumpled dollar bill, sometimes adding a few coins if I'd been particularly well behaved that day. "Stay on our street," she'd call after me as I raced back outside, "and look both ways before you cross." But I was already gone, clutching that precious dollar in my sweaty palm and calculating exactly how much time I had before the truck reached our section of the neighbourhood. The song was getting louder now, and I could hear other kids starting to emerge from their houses, all of us drawn like moths to that musical flame. The truck itself was this wonderful, beat-up white van covered in colourful pictures of popsicles and ice cream bars. The paint was faded and peeling in places, and the whole thing looked like it had been driving through summers for decades, collecting the dreams and sugar cravings of countless kids along the way. The driver was this older man named Mr. Rodriguez, who always wore a baseball cap and seemed genuinely happy to see us every day. He'd park at the corner and open up the side window, revealing a freezer full of frozen treasures that looked more appealing than anything I'd ever seen in a regular store. The decision-making process was always agonizing. There were rocket-shaped popsicles with gumball tips, ice cream sandwiches wrapped in paper that stuck to your fingers, push-up pops that changed colors as you ate them, and those character-shaped bars where you never quite knew if you'd get all the facial features intact. But my go-to choice was always the same: a blue raspberry slush puppy that came in a plastic cup with a dome lid and a spoon-straw combination that was clearly designed by a genius. The blue was so artificially vibrant that it probably glowed in the dark, and it tasted like liquid summer vacation. The whole transaction had to happen quickly because Mr. Rodriguez couldn't stay parked in one spot for too long, and there were other neighbourhoods waiting for their turn. I'd hand over my dollar, receive my frozen treasure, and immediately tear into it like I'd been stranded in the desert for days. The best part wasn't even eating the ice cream, though. It was the sense of community that happened around that truck. Kids from different streets and different grades would all converge at the same corner, united by our shared love of overpriced frozen treats. We'd compare our choices, trade bites of different flavours, and establish temporary friendships based entirely on similar taste in artificial blue beverages. Sometimes I'd try to make my ice cream last as long as possible, savouring each spoonful while sitting on the curb with whoever else was extending their sugar rush. Other days I'd devour it so quickly that I'd get brain freeze and have to press my tongue to the roof of my mouth while making those involuntary squeaking sounds that come with frozen-induced head pain. The song would start up again as Mr. Rodriguez prepared to move on to the next street, and we'd all wave goodbye like he was a departing cruise ship rather than a refrigerated van. Then we'd scatter back to our respective houses, blue-tongued and happy, already anticipating tomorrow's 3:00 p.m. concert. On the rare occasions when I didn't have $1, or when I'd already spent my allowance on something else, I'd still run outside just to hear the song and watch the other kids enjoy their kids get their treats. There was something almost as satisfying about the ritual itself, the daily promise that summer was still happening and magic could still roll down your street in the form of a beat-up van playing tinny music. The worst days were when it rained, because Mr. Rodriguez wouldn't come around in bad weather. I'd sit by the window listening for that song that never came, feeling like the day was fundamentally broken without its soundtrack. My mum would try to cheer me up by making homemade popsicles from juice and ice cube trays, but they weren't the same. They didn't come with music or community or the thrill of flagging down your own personal ice cream delivery service. As the summer progressed, I memorized Mr. Rodriguez's route so completely that I could predict exactly when he'd reach each street. I knew he started at the elementary school and worked his way through Maple Avenue, then Oak Street, then finally our street before heading toward the park. I became a 6-year-old ice cream truck meteorologist, tracking his movements like he was a delicious storm system. The song became the official soundtrack of my summer. I'd hum it while riding my bike, whistle it while building sandcastles in our backyard sandbox, and sometimes catch myself singing it in the shower. It represented everything good about being a kid, with nowhere important to be, and nothing more pressing to worry about than whether I had enough change for a rocket pop. Even now, when I hear that distinctive ice cream truck melody floating through a neighborhood, I'm instantly transported back to those perfect summer afternoons. I can feel the heat of the pavement through my sneakers, taste that artificial blue raspberry flavor, and remember what it felt like when the biggest decision of your day was choosing between a character bar and a push-up pop. That story is over. The ice cream truck song is probably one of the most universal childhood experiences, and Jacob perfectly captured that Pavlovian response every kid has to those tinny notes floating through the air. The way he described becoming an ice cream truck meteorologist is hilarious and so accurate. There's something beautiful about how a simple frozen treat can create an instant community of kids who might not otherwise play together. Let's move to our next story about the ultimate childhood hideaway, the treehouse that felt like another world. This story comes from Ava. My dad built it for me when I was 8 years old, spending every weekend for 2 months climbing up and down the massive oak tree in our backyard with his toolbox and an endless supply of patience. It wasn't just a platform with walls like some tree houses I'd seen. This was a proper little house, complete with a shingled roof, real windows with glass panes, and a Dutch door that made me feel like I was living in a fairy tale. The tree itself was ancient and enormous, with thick branches that spread out like protective arms over half our backyard. Dad had chosen the perfect spot, about 12 feet up, where 3 major branches converged to create a natural foundation. The treehouse sat nestled among the leaves, like it had grown there naturally, like the tree had always been planning to sprout a little wooden room among its branches. Getting up there was an adventure in itself. Dad had built a proper ladder with wooden rungs nailed directly into the trunk, and climbing up felt like ascending to a secret kingdom that existed parallel to the regular world, but somehow separate from it. The higher I climbed, the more the everyday sounds of the neighborhood would fade away, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the conversations of birds who seemed surprised to find a human visitor in their territory. Inside, the treehouse was cozy and perfect. Dad had installed a small window on each wall, so I could look out in every direction and feel like I was surveying my domain from a castle tower. The floor was covered with outdoor carpet that felt soft under my bare feet, and there was a built-in bench along one wall where I kept my most treasured possessions. I turned that treehouse into my personal art studio and library branch. I'd carry up sketch pads and coloured pencils, spending hours drawing the view from my elevated perspective. Birds looked different when you were closer to their level, and I filled dozens of notebooks with pictures of cardinals and blue jays and the occasional squirrel who would venture close enough to pose. I also hauled up a steady stream of books, creating my own private reading room, surrounded by living walls of green leaves. There was something magical about reading adventure stories while actually sitting in my own adventure, perched high above the world, with only the wind and the tree for company. The light that filtered through the leaves created this constantly shifting pattern on the pages, like the tree was helping illustrate the stories. Some afternoons I'd just sit quietly and listen to the different world that existed up there among the branches. The sounds were softer and more layered than what you heard on the ground. I could hear conversations from neighbouring yards that seemed far away and dreamlike. I could identify different birds by their calls and track their movements through the surrounding trees. The treehouse became my go-to destination whenever I needed to think or just escape from the complications of being a kid. When my parents were arguing, when school was stressful, when my friends were being dramatic, I could climb up to my tree and everything would feel manageable again. There was something about being surrounded by all that growing, living green that put problems into perspective. I spent countless hours up there working on secret projects. I wrote stories and poems that I was too shy to share with anyone. I planned elaborate adventures I was going to have when I got older. I practiced conversations I wanted to have with people who intimidated me, using the patient oak branches as my audience. The treehouse was also where I did my most serious thinking about the big questions that occupy 8-year-old minds. I'd lie on my back, looking up through the canopy, and wonder about space and infinity, and whether trees had feelings, and what it would be like to be a bird. The tree seemed like the perfect companion for these deep philosophical discussions with myself. During different seasons, the treehouse transformed into completely different places. In spring, when the oak was budding with tiny new leaves, it felt fresh and full of possibility. Summer turned it into a cool, green cave where I could escape the heat. Fall was the most spectacular, when I was surrounded by a living stained glass window of gold and red leaves. Even in winter, when the branches were bare and I could see much farther in all directions, it felt magical and stark and peaceful. My friends were always impressed by the treehouse, and occasionally I'd invite someone up to share my secret world. But honestly, it was better as a solitary retreat. Other people changed the energy somehow, made it feel less like my private sanctuary and more like just another place to play. As I got older and busier with school and activities, I visited the treehouse less frequently. By high school, I'd basically outgrown my need for that particular kind of escape. But sometimes I'd still climb up there when I needed to think, and the tree would welcome me back like an old friend who'd been patiently waiting. When I moved away for college, my parents kept the treehouse intact for a few years, like they knew I might need it when I came home to visit. Eventually, they had to take it down when the tree developed some disease and became unsafe. But for those few crucial years of my childhood, I had my own private kingdom in the sky, a place where imagination could run wild and the world looked different from every window. That story is over. There's something so special about a parent who understands that kids need their own space to dream and create. Ava's description of the treehouse, transforming with the seasons and serving as both art studio and philosophy corner, perfectly captures how these private spaces become essential to childhood development. The image of her lying on her back, contemplating infinity while surrounded by oak leaves, is just beautiful. Our next story brings us into the magic of waking up to a transformed world. The first snow day I ever remember. This story comes from Sam. I was 5 years old, and it was early December in Minnesota, which meant snow was always a possibility, but never a guarantee of the kind that would shut down schools. I'd gone to bed the night before listening to my parents whisper about weather forecasts and something about a storm system moving in. But I was too young to really understand what that might mean for my kindergarten plans. I remember waking up in a world that felt different before I even opened my eyes. The quality of light coming through my bedroom curtains was all wrong, too bright and clean for a regular winter morning. And there was this strange quiet, like someone had wrapped our entire house in a giant blanket that muffled all the normal sounds of cars and dogs and people starting their day. When I finally climbed out of bed and pulled back my curtains, I literally gasped. The entire world outside my window had been transformed overnight into something that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. Snow covered everything as far as I could see, not just a light dusting, but deep, perfect drifts that had reshaped our familiar neighbourhood into an alien wonderland. Our car in the driveway was nothing but a white mound with just the antenna poking through. The fence posts looked like they were wearing tall white hats, and every tree branch was outlined in thick frosting that made the whole landscape look like it had been decorated by some cosmic baker. Even the air looked different, filled with tiny sparkles that danced in the morning sunlight. "Mum! Dad!" I shouted, running down the hall in my pyjamas. "Come look outside, the snow ate everything." My parents were already up, standing in the kitchen with coffee cups and big grins on their faces. Dad was listening to something on the radio, and when he saw me bouncing with excitement, he turned the volume down and made an official announcement. "Well, Sam," he said in his most serious voice, "it looks like school is cancelled today. They're calling it a snow emergency, which means nobody's supposed to drive anywhere unless it's really, really important." I didn't fully understand what a snow emergency meant, but I definitely understood that no school equaled the best possible start to any day. I pressed my face against the kitchen window and watched our neighbour, Mr. Peterson, attempting to dig out his driveway with a shovel that looked tiny and useless against the massive amount of snow. After breakfast, my parents helped me put on what felt like 17 layers of winter clothes. Long underwear, regular clothes, snow pants, boots, 2 pairs of socks, a heavy coat, mittens, a hat, and a scarf that wrapped around my face so many times I could barely see. I looked like a small colourful marshmallow with legs. Stepping outside was like entering an entirely different planet. The snow was deeper than my knees in some places, and walking through it required a kind of high-stepping march that made me feel like I was leading a one-person parade. Every step made this satisfying crunching sound, and I could see my breath making little puff clouds in the cold air. I spent the entire morning exploring this new winter world. I discovered that snow had magical properties I'd never experienced before. You could pack it into balls and throw them at trees. You could dig tunnels and caves that felt like secret hiding places. You could eat it, though my mum warned me to only eat the really clean, white stuff from the top of piles. The best discovery was that I could make a perfect impression of my entire body by falling backward into the snow and moving my arms and legs back and forth. When I stood up carefully and looked back, there was a perfect snow angel that looked almost like it could fly away on its own. I made dozens of them across our yard, creating what I imagined was an entire snow angel army. My dad came outside and showed me how to roll snowballs that started small but got bigger and bigger as they picked up more snow. We worked together to build a snowman in our front yard, and I was amazed at how the snow seemed to want to stick together, like it was cooperating with our creative vision. Finding the right sticks for arms and stones for buttons became a serious treasure hunt, and when we finally stepped back to admire our creation, I felt like we'd built something truly magical. The snowman looked friendly and permanent, like he'd always lived in our yard and was just now introducing himself. But the most incredible part of that first snow day was the silence. Our usually busy street was completely empty of cars, and the snow seemed to absorb all the regular neighbourhood sounds. It was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat, and the soft whisper of snow, still occasionally falling from tree branches. When evening came, and it was time to go inside, I felt like I was leaving behind a secret world that might disappear by morning. I kept looking back through the window, half expecting the snow to melt away and reveal our regular brown and grey December landscape. But when I woke up the next morning, it was all still there, maybe even deeper than before. And suddenly I understood that winter wasn't just cold weather I had to endure until spring came back. Winter was its own season of magic that brought entirely different possibilities for adventure and wonder. That story is over. There's something so pure about a child's first real encounter with deep snow and the way it transforms the familiar world into something magical and new. Sam's description of feeling like he was on an alien planet perfectly captures that sense of wonder when nature completely changes the rules overnight. The detail about the Snow Angel army is just perfect, and you can almost hear that special silence that only comes with heavy snow. The old library smell. This story comes from Grace. Our town's library was tiny, probably smaller than most people's living rooms, but to me it felt like the most important building in the entire world. It was housed in this old Victorian house that had been converted sometime in the 1960s, with creaky wooden floors that announced your arrival, no matter how quietly you tried to walk. Mrs. Henderson had been the librarian there for as long as anyone could remember. She was maybe 65, with silver hair always pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore these thin reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain around her neck. She knew every single book in that place and could recommend exactly what you needed before you even knew you needed it. But what I remember most about that library wasn't Mrs. Henderson or even the books themselves. It was the smell. The moment you opened that heavy wooden door, you were hit with this incredible combination of old paper, dust, leather bindings, and something else I could never quite identify, but always made me feel like I was about to discover something amazing. I was maybe 7 years old when I started visiting regularly. My mum would drop me off every Saturday morning while she ran errands, and I'd spend hours just wandering between the tall wooden shelves, pulling out books at random and breathing in that perfect library air. Each section seemed to have its own variation of the smell. The picture books smelled bright and clean. The old novels had this deep, rich aroma, and the reference section in the back corner smelled mysterious and important. I developed this ritual where I'd pick a book, find the reading corner with its ancient velvet armchair, and before I even opened to the first page, I'd hold the book close to my face and just inhale. Every book had its own story in smell alone. Some smelled like vanilla and adventure, others like dust and secrets. The really old ones had this almost sweet smell that made me think of attics and treasure chests. Mrs. Henderson never seemed to mind that I spent as much time smelling books as reading them. Sometimes she'd catch me doing it and just smile like she understood exactly what I was experiencing. Once she told me that books absorbed the emotions of everyone who'd read them, and that's why they smelled like stories waiting to be discovered. The library had this one section in the very back that was my absolute favourite. It was where they kept the oldest books, the ones with cloth covers and pages that felt like tissue paper. These books smelled different from all the others, like they'd been storing up decades of readers' dreams and carrying them forward for the next person to find. I'd spend entire Saturday mornings back there, carefully pulling books from the shelves and sampling their individual fragrances like I was some kind of literary sommelier. Adventure books smelled bold and exciting. Poetry collections had this light, airy scent. And the fairy tale books somehow managed to smell magical, like cinnamon and starlight mixed together. Years later, when I moved away for college, I tried visiting other libraries, bigger ones with more books and better facilities, but none of them smelled right. They smelled sterile and new, like cleaning products and fresh carpet. They didn't have that perfect combination of age and stories and countless readers that made our little town library feel like home. When I came back to visit my parents last year, the first place I went was that old library. Mrs. Henderson had retired, and there was a younger librarian who seemed nice enough, But when I opened that heavy wooden door, the smell hit me like a time machine. Suddenly, I was 7 years old again, standing between those tall shelves with my heart racing about which book to choose next. I found my way back to the old book section and pulled out a familiar fairy tale collection. When I held it up to my face and breathed in, I could swear I smelled not just the book itself, but every Saturday morning I'd spent in that reading corner, every adventure I'd discovered, every moment of wonder that little library had given me. That story's over. There's something so beautiful about how smell can transport us instantly back to childhood, and Grace perfectly captured that unique library atmosphere that every book lover recognises. The idea that books absorb the emotions of their readers is just magical, and you can almost smell that perfect combination of dust and dreams she's describing. Libraries really do have their own special magic. Our next story takes us to the shore and the treasures that call to us from the sand. The beach shell I carried home. This story comes from Oliver. I was 8 years old on my first real family vacation to the ocean. We'd driven for what felt like days to reach this little coastal town in North Carolina, and I'd spent the entire car ride pressing my face against the window, trying to catch my first glimpse of something I'd only seen in pictures and movies. When we finally arrived at our rental house and I saw the actual ocean stretching out beyond the dunes, I couldn't believe how enormous it was. It went on forever in every direction, this endless expanse of blue-green water that seemed to breathe thee as waves rolled in and out. The sound was incredible too, this constant whooshing rhythm that made everything else seem quiet by comparison. My parents spent the first day getting organised and unpacking, but all I wanted to do was get down to that beach and start exploring. I'd never seen so much sand in one place, and I'd definitely never seen anything like the treasures that were scattered everywhere, just waiting to be discovered. The morning of our second day, I woke up before everyone else and convinced my dad to take me on an early beach walk. The sun was just coming up, painting the sky in these incredible shades of pink and orange that reflected off the wet sand like a mirror. There were hardly any people around, just a few joggers in the distance, and some seagulls having loud conversations about whatever seagulls discuss at dawn. That's when I found it. We'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when something caught my eye in a patch of shells that had been left behind by the retreating tide. Most of the shells were small and broken, the kind you might glance at but not really notice, but this one was different. It was huge, at least compared to anything I'd ever seen, and it was perfectly intact. The shell was spiral-shaped, like a cone that twisted up to a perfect point, and it was easily the size of my entire hand. The outside was this beautiful cream colour with brown stripes that spiralled around from the base to the tip, and when I picked it up, I was surprised by how heavy it felt. This wasn't some fragile little decoration. This was something solid and real and important. "Dad, look at this," I called out, holding up my discovery like I'd just found buried treasure. He came over and examined the shell with the same serious attention he gave to important grown-up things. "That's a beauty," he said, turning it over in his hands. "Looks like a whelk shell. This is probably from a pretty big sea snail that used to live inside." The idea that this perfect shell had once been someone's house made it even more magical to me. I imagined the snail that had grown this beautiful spiral home, carrying it around on the ocean floor, adding new layers as it got bigger, and now it was mine, like the ocean had left me a personal gift. But the most incredible discovery came when my dad showed me something I never would have thought to try. He held the shell up to his ear and told me to listen carefully. When I pressed the opening against my ear, I could hear what sounded like the ocean itself, this soft whooshing sound that seemed to capture the rhythm of the waves. "It's the ocean," I whispered, amazed that something so small could contain something so vast. "That's what they say," my dad replied with a smile. "Some people think you can hear the sea in any shell, no matter how far from the ocean you take it." I spent the rest of our vacation carrying that shell everywhere, showing it to my mum, my little sister, random strangers on the beach who seemed willing to admire my treasure. I'd hold it up to my ear constantly, listening to that mysterious sound and wondering if it really was the ocean or something else entirely. When it was time to pack up and head home, I was worried my parents would make me leave the shell behind. It was pretty big and took up a lot of space in our luggage, and I'd heard horror stories about kids having to abandon beach treasures because there wasn't room in the car, but my dad understood how important it was to me and helped me wrap it carefully in towels so it wouldn't break during the drive. That shell sat on my bedroom dresser for years, and I'd pick it up regularly to listen for the ocean inside. Sometimes I swore I could hear waves crashing. Other times it sounded more like wind or distant music. As I got older, I learned that the sound was probably just the echo of my own blood circulating and the ambient noise around me, but I never stopped believing there was something magical about it. Even now, as an adult, when I hold that shell up to my ear, I'm instantly transported back to that early morning beach walk with my dad. I can feel the cool sand between my toes, smell the salt air, and remember the incredible excitement of finding something the ocean had decided to share with me. That shell taught me that the best souvenirs aren't things you buy in gift shops, but treasures you discover when you're paying attention to the world around you. And sometimes, if you listen carefully enough, those treasures will carry the sound of the place you found them for the rest of your life. That story is over. There's something so perfect about a kid finding their first real seashell and believing they can carry the ocean home with them. Oliver's description of that early morning discovery and his dad taking the time to explain what they'd found shows how these simple moments become lifelong memories. The magic of hearing the ocean in a shell never really goes away, even when we learn the science behind it. Our next story brings us to one of childhood's most anticipated moments. The candle on my birthday cake. This story comes from Leah. I was turning 4 years old, and it was going to be my first birthday where I was actually old enough to understand what was happening. My previous birthdays existed only in photo albums and family stories, but this one was going to be mine to remember. My mum had been building up the excitement for weeks, asking me what kind of cake I wanted and whether I preferred chocolate or vanilla frosting. I'd changed my mind about 15 times, finally settling on chocolate cake with pink frosting and rainbow sprinkles. In my 4-year-old mind, this seemed like the most sophisticated and delicious combination possible. The day of my birthday, I woke up to find our kitchen transformed. There were balloons tied to every chair, streamers hanging from the ceiling, and a pile of wrapped presents on the counter that made my eyes go wide with anticipation. But the centerpiece of it all was the cake sitting on our dining room table, covered with a clean dish towel, like it was hiding a wonderful secret. All day long, that covered cake sat there taunting me. Every time I walked through the dining room, I'd try to peek under the towel, but my mum would catch me and shoo me away with reminders that I had to wait until after dinner. The anticipation was almost unbearable, like Christmas morning stretched out over an entire day. My grandparents and aunt and uncle came over for dinner, and I could barely sit still through the meal. Everyone kept asking me about being 4 now, and whether I felt any different. But honestly, all I could think about was whatever was waiting under that dish towel. I ate my spaghetti as quickly as possible, hoping we could move on to the important part of the evening. Finally, after what felt like 17 hours, my mum announced that it was time for cake. She disappeared into the kitchen while everyone else gathered around the dining room table, and I stood on my chair so I could see everything that was about to happen. When she lifted that dish towel, I literally gasped. My cake was even more beautiful than I'd imagined, covered in the brightest pink frosting I'd ever seen, with rainbow sprinkles scattered across the top like confetti. But the most magical part was the single white candle standing right in the centre, waiting for me like a tiny lighthouse. My mum struck a match, and everyone got quiet as she lit that candle. The little flame danced and flickered, casting shadows that made the pink frosting look like it was glowing. Someone started singing "Happy Birthday," and all the grown-ups joined in while I stood there mesmerised by that perfect little fire that belonged just to me. "Make a wish, sweetheart," my mum said when the song ended. I closed my eyes tight and made the most important wish I could think of. I can't remember now what I wished for, but I remember the feeling of knowing I had one chance to ask the universe for something special, and that tiny flame was somehow going to carry my wish wherever wishes go. When I opened my eyes, everyone was watching me expectantly. I took the deepest breath I could manage with my 4-year-old lungs and blew as hard as I possibly could. The candle went out immediately, and everyone cheered like I'd just performed the most amazing magic trick in the world. The kitchen filled with the smell of the blown-out candle, that slightly smoky scent that means celebrations and wishes coming true. My mum cut the cake and served pieces to everyone, and I felt like the most important person in the entire world as I ate my perfect chocolate cake with pink frosting and rainbow sprinkles. That story is over. There's something so pure about a child's first real birthday memory, and the way a single candle can feel like the most magical thing in the world. The ritual of making a wish and believing completely that blowing out that flame might actually make it come true captures that beautiful childhood faith in possibility. You can almost smell that blown out candle and feel the excitement of being the center of everyone's attention on your special day. Our next story takes us into the entrepreneurial spirit of summer and the sweetness of childhood ambition. The Summer Lemonade Stand. This story comes from Max. I was 7 years old and my sister Lucy was 5. It was one of those blazing hot July days when the pavement seemed to shimmer with heat waves, and even the birds looked like they were panting in whatever shade they could find. We'd been complaining about being bored for most of the morning when my mum made a suggestion that would change our entire summer. "Why don't you two set up a lemonade stand?" she said, probably just trying to get us out of her hair while she finished some housework. "You could make some spending money and help people cool off on this hot day." Lucy and I looked at each other with the kind of excitement that only comes from a brilliant new idea. We'd seen lemonade stands in movies and TV shows, but it had never occurred to us that we could actually run one ourselves. Suddenly, we weren't just bored kids anymore. We were entrepreneurs with a mission. We spent the next hour gathering supplies and setting up our operation on the sidewalk in front of our house. Mum helped us drag out a small folding table and gave us an old bedsheet to use as a tablecloth. We made a sign with markers and poster board that said "Fresh lemonade 25 cents" in letters that got progressively smaller as we ran out of space. The lemonade making process was an adventure in itself. Mum supervised while Lucy and I took turns squeezing lemons, our small hands struggling with the citrus press and getting sticky juice all over everything. We added water and sugar, tasted it, added more sugar, tasted it again, and declared it the most delicious lemonade in the history of the world. We set up our stand right at the corner where our street intersected with the main road through our neighbourhood, figuring we'd get maximum foot traffic there. Lucy arranged plastic cups in neat rows, while I counted out change from our mum's spare coin jar. We felt incredibly professional and official. The waiting was the hardest part. We sat behind our little table in the blazing sun, watching cars drive by and hoping desperately that someone would stop. Every person who walked past became a potential customer, and we'd wave enthusiastically and call out, "Fresh lemonade, only 25 cents, until our voices got hoarse. Our first customer was Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down, who was walking her ancient golden retriever. She stopped and made a big show of examining our setup, asking serious questions about our ingredients and business model, like we were applying for a loan. When she finally bought a cup and took a sip, her face lit up with exaggerated delight. "This is absolutely delicious," she declared, fishing $1 out of her pocket. "Keep the change. You two are going to be very successful business people." We were so excited about our first sale that we high-fived and danced around behind the table, while Mrs. Patterson laughed and continued her walk. 75 cents profit on our very first transaction felt like winning the lottery. Word seemed to spread through the neighbourhood somehow, because over the next few hours we had a steady stream of customers. Mr. Johnson from the corner house bought 2 cups and complimented our entrepreneurial spirit. The mailman stopped during his route and said our lemonade was exactly what he needed on such a hot day. Even some teenagers walking by bought cups and left us quarters as tips. The best part wasn't even making money, though it was how important and grown up we felt. We were providing a genuine service, helping people cool off on a scorching summer day. We were learning about customer service, money management, and the satisfaction that comes from working hard and seeing results. By the time the sun started getting lower and we decided to pack up for the day, we'd made almost $8. To two kids who usually got a $1 allowance each week, this felt like enormous wealth. We split the money evenly and immediately started planning how we'd spend our newfound fortune. That lemonade stand became our summer job. We set up almost every day when the weather was nice, gradually improving our operation with better signage, a cash box, and even some cookies that Mum helped us bake to sell alongside the lemonade. We learned about supply and demand when we raised our prices on particularly hot days and discovered that people were willing to pay extra for ice-cold refreshments. Years later, whenever I drive through neighbourhoods and see kids with their own lemonade stands, I always stop and buy a cup. Not because I'm particularly thirsty, but because I remember how it felt to be 7 years old and convinced that we were running the most important business in the world. There's something beautiful about that kind of childhood optimism, and the way a simple card table and some squeezed lemons can make you feel like you can conquer anything. That story is over. The pure entrepreneurial spirit of childhood lemonade stands never fails to make me smile, and Max perfectly captured that feeling of being a serious business person at 7 years old. The detail about getting progressively more excited with each customer and feeling like they were providing a genuine service shows how these simple summer projects become lessons in confidence and community connection. Let's move to our next story about the magic of experiencing something bigger than yourself for the first time. The first movie I saw at the theatre. This story comes from Isla. I was 6 years old, and going to see a movie in an actual movie theatre felt like the most grown-up thing I'd ever been invited to do. My mum had been building up the excitement for weeks, explaining that this wasn't like watching movies at home on our small TV. This was going to be something special, something bigger and more magical than anything I'd experienced before. The movie theatre in our town was this grand old building from the 1940s with a marquee out front that spelled out movie titles in big black letters. Just walking up to those glass doors made me feel like I was entering somewhere important, somewhere reserved for special occasions and memorable experiences. The lobby was incredible, with red carpeted floors that felt thick under my feet and the most amazing smell I'd ever encountered. It was buttery and salty and sweet all at once, with hints of something that made my mouth water before I even knew what I was smelling. Years later, I'd learned that this was the legendary movie theatre popcorn aroma, but at 6 years old, it was just pure magic in the form of a scent. My mum bought our tickets from a woman behind a glass window who seemed impossibly glamorous to me. Then we got in line for snacks. The concession stand was like a candy store and restaurant combined, with rows of colourful boxes and machines that made mysterious bubbling and popping sounds. I chose a box of Junior Mints and a small Coke, feeling very sophisticated about my selections. But the real magic happened when we walked through the heavy doors into the actual theatre. I literally stopped in the doorway and stared. The room was enormous, with rows and rows of red velvet seats that seemed to stretch on forever toward a screen that was bigger than the entire wall of our living room. The ceiling was decorated with tiny lights that twinkled like stars, and everything felt hushed and expectant. We found seats about halfway down, and I climbed up into my chair, which was so big that my feet barely touched the floor. The armrests were padded, and there was a cup holder that seemed designed specifically for my Coke. I felt like I was sitting in the most comfortable chair in the world, surrounded by other people who were all waiting for the same magical experience I was about to have. As more people filed in, the anticipation in the room grew stronger. Everyone was talking in excited whispers, and kids were bouncing in their seats, while parents organised snacks and reminded them to use the bathroom before the movie started. The whole atmosphere felt like Christmas morning stretched out over 20 minutes. Then the lights began to dim and a hush fell over the entire theatre. The screen lit up with previews for other movies, but even those felt special and important when they were projected on something so massive. Colours seemed brighter, sounds seemed clearer, and everything felt more real and more magical at the same time. When the actual movie finally started, I was completely mesmerised. The characters were so big I could see every expression on their faces, and the music surrounded us from speakers I couldn't even see. It felt like we'd been transported into the story itself, like we were part of the adventure instead of just watching it from the outside. I don't remember much about the specific plot of the movie we saw, but I remember the feeling of being completely absorbed in something bigger than myself. For 2 hours, nothing existed except that giant screen and the story unfolding in front of us. I forgot about my junior mints, forgot about my Coke, forgot about everything except the incredible experience of being inside a movie theatre for the first time. When the credits started rolling and the lights came back up, I felt like I was waking up from the most wonderful dream. The spell was broken, but I was still buzzing with excitement about what I'd just experienced. Walking back out into the lobby, I felt different somehow, like I'd been initiated into some kind of secret club of people who understood the magic of movies. On the drive home, I couldn't stop talking about everything I'd seen and heard and felt. My mum smiled and nodded as I babbled about the giant screen and the amazing sound and how much better everything looked in the theatre. She said she'd been waiting for me to be old enough to really appreciate the experience, and that now we could start going to movies together regularly. That became one of our special traditions, going to see movies at that old theatre with the twinkling ceiling and the magical popcorn smell. Even now, as an adult, whenever I walk into a movie theatre, I'm transported back to that first experience of wonder and anticipation. There's still something magical about those dimming lights and that enormous screen, even though I've seen it hundreds of times since. That story is over. The magic of a child's first movie theatre experience is something that never quite gets replicated, and Isla perfectly captured that sense of awe at discovering something so much bigger than home entertainment. The detail about feeling like they'd been transported into the story itself shows how these large-scale experiences can expand a kid's sense of what's possible in the world. Our next story takes us into the territory of childhood endurance challenges and the bonds formed during late-night adventures. The sleepover that lasted all night. This story comes from Theo. I was 9 years old, and my best friends Jake, Dylan, and Marcus were all sleeping over at my house for the first time ever. We'd been planning this epic sleepover for weeks, and we had made a solemn pact that we were going to stay awake all night long, no matter what. To our 9-year-old minds, this seemed like the ultimate test of coolness and endurance. My mum had set up the living room with sleeping bags and pillows arranged in a circle, and she'd stocked up on all the essential sleepover supplies: pizza, soda, popcorn, candy, and a stack of movies that we probably wouldn't have time to watch if we were serious about our mission to defeat sleep. She'd also made it very clear that we needed to keep the noise down after 10 o'clock so we wouldn't wake up my little sister. The evening started exactly as you'd expect from 4 boys hopped up on sugar and freedom. We played video games until our thumbs were sore, had elaborate battles with foam swords in the backyard, and consumed enough junk food to power a small aircraft. By 9 o'clock we were all riding a sugar high that made staying awake until dawn seem not just possible, but inevitable. We'd prepared for our all-night challenge, like we were planning a military operation. We had backup snacks hidden around the room, caffeinated sodas that we'd been saving for when we got really tired, and a list of activities designed to keep us alert. Truth or dare, scary stories, prank calls to random numbers, and a tournament of every board game we could find. The first few hours were easy. We told ghost stories that made us jump at every sound, played increasingly ridiculous rounds of truth or dare that had us doing things like calling the pizza place to ask if they delivered to Mars, and had debates about important topics like which superhero would win in various hypothetical battles. The living room felt like our own private universe, where normal rules didn't apply. Around midnight, we hit our first wall of tiredness, but we pushed through it with a combination of sugar, determination, and peer pressure. Nobody wanted to be the first one to fall asleep and face the inevitable mockery that would come with being labelled the weakest member of our group. We made more popcorn, opened emergency candy supplies, and cranked up our energy with jumping jacks and push-up contests. The middle hours of the night were when things started getting weird in the best possible way. Everything seemed funnier than it should have been. Jake's impression of our math teacher had us laughing until our stomachs hurt, and Dylan's story about his embarrassing encounter with his crush became the funniest thing any of us had ever heard. We were definitely reaching that overtired state where everything becomes hilarious and nothing quite makes sense. Around 3 a.m, we discovered that staying awake all night was less about energy and more about willpower. We weren't really tired in a sleepy way anymore. We were tired in a strange floating way that made us feel like we were existing in a different dimension. We'd moved past normal tiredness into something that felt almost like being awake in a dream. We spent the darkest hours of the night having conversations that felt incredibly deep and important at the time. We talked about our fears, our dreams, what we wanted to be when we grew up, whether aliens existed, and what it would be like to be adults. These weren't the kinds of conversations we usually had during normal daylight hours, but something about being awake when the rest of the world was sleeping made everything feel more honest and significant. The hardest part came around 5 a.m. when our bodies really started rebelling against our mission. Marcus kept nodding off, while sitting upright. Dylan was getting cranky about everything, and Jake suggested maybe we could just rest our eyes for a few minutes, but we'd come too far to give up now. We were so close to seeing the sunrise that quitting felt like betraying everything we'd worked for. We made it through those final hours by telling more stories, sharing our most embarrassing moments, and making plans for future adventures. We talked about how we'd always remember this night, how it proved we could do anything if we stuck together, and how we were probably the first kids in our grade to successfully stay awake for an entire night. When the first light of dawn started filtering through the living room windows, we felt like conquering heroes. We'd actually done it. We'd stayed awake for almost 12 straight hours, seen the sun go down and come back up, and lived to tell about it. We were exhausted and probably looked terrible, but we felt incredibly accomplished. My mum found us collapsed in our sleeping bags around 7 a.m, barely conscious, but still technically awake. She just shook her head and smiled, probably remembering her own childhood attempts to defeat sleep. She made us pancakes for breakfast, and we ate them like zombies, too tired to be properly excited about our victory. We all went home that morning and slept for most of the day, but we'd proven something important to ourselves. We'd set a goal that seemed impossible and achieved it through teamwork, determination, and an impressive amount of junk food. That sleepover became legendary in our friend group, the standard against which all future sleepovers were measured. That story is over. The determination of kids trying to stay awake all night is both admirable and slightly insane, and Theo perfectly captured that weird twilight zone you enter when you're running on sugar and willpower alone. The way they moved from silly games to deep philosophical conversations shows how these endurance challenges can create unexpected moments of connection and vulnerability between friends. This next story brings us to the simple joy of watching something you've created finally take flight, the kite that finally lifted off. This story comes from Naomi. I was 8 years old, and my dad had bought me my first real kite for my birthday. Not one of those cheap plastic ones from the grocery store, but a proper diamond-shaped kite with a long fabric tail and bright red and yellow panels that looked like they were designed to dance with the wind. The problem was, I had no idea how to make it fly. We'd tried launching it in our backyard several times, but something always went wrong. Either there wasn't enough wind, or I'd run out of space before it could catch air, or I'd trip over the string and send the whole thing crashing into the fence. After 3 failed attempts, I was starting to think that maybe I just wasn't meant to be a kite flyer. My dad could see how frustrated I was getting, so he suggested we take the kite to the big field at the elementary school, where there was more room to run and better wind conditions. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the field was empty except for a few joggers on the track, and some kids playing soccer in the distance. Perfect kite-flying weather, according to my dad's expert assessments. He spent a few minutes explaining the theory behind kite flying, while I stood there trying to look like I was paying attention instead of just wanting to get started. He talked about wind direction and angles and how important it was to feel the tension in the string, but honestly, most of it went over my head. I just wanted to see that beautiful kite soaring up in the sky where it belonged. We started at one end of the field, with my dad holding the kite high above his head, while I gripped the spool of string about 20 feet away. The plan was simple. He'd release the kite when I started running, and hopefully the wind would catch it and carry it upward. In theory, it sounded foolproof. The first attempt was a disaster. I took off running as fast as I could, feeling the string tug as the kite tried to follow, but when I looked back, it was just dragging along the ground behind me like a colourful flag. My dad jogged over and explained that I needed to run into the wind, not away from it, which seemed counterintuitive, but apparently made perfect sense to people who understood aerodynamics. We tried again, this time with me running directly toward the breeze. I could feel on my face. The kite lifted off the ground for a few seconds, and I felt my heart leap with excitement, but then it nosedived back down and scraped along the grass, close but not quite there yet. "Don't give up," my dad called out, jogging over to retrieve the kite. "You're getting the hang of it. This time, try to feel when it catches the wind, then ease up on your running and let the wind do the work." The third attempt started exactly like the previous ones, with me sprinting across the field while the kite bounced and struggled behind me. But then something magical happened. I felt the string suddenly go taut in my hands, like something strong had grabbed hold of the other end and was pulling upward. When I looked back, the kite was climbing, actually climbing, rising steadily into the afternoon sky. "Keep going," my dad shouted from somewhere behind me. "You've got it! Let out more string!" I was so excited, I nearly tripped over my own feet, but I managed to keep running while gradually releasing more line. The kite climbed higher and higher, its red and yellow panels catching the sunlight, and its long tail streaming out behind it like a banner. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Eventually, I stopped running and just stood there in the middle of that field, holding the spool while my kite danced in the wind high above me. I could feel its movements through the string, the way it would tug when it caught a strong gust, the way it would settle into a gentle sway when the air was calm. It felt alive, like I was connected to something wild and free. My dad came over and stood beside me, both of us craning our necks to watch the kite perform its aerial ballet. "How does it feel?" he asked, and I could hear the pride in his voice. "Like magic," I said, and I meant it. There was something incredible about controlling something so far away, about being connected to that dancing diamond through nothing but a thin string and the power of the wind. We stood there for at least an hour, taking turns holding the spool and watching the kite explore different altitudes and attitudes. Sometimes it would climb so high it looked tiny against the clouds. Other times it would swoop lower, like it was coming down to say hello. My dad taught me how to make it dance by pulling and releasing the string, how to read the wind by watching the kite's behaviour. When it was finally time to bring it down, I felt genuinely sad to end the flight. Reeling in that string and watching the kite descend felt like saying goodbye to a friend who'd shown me what it was like to fly. But as we walked back to the car, with the kite folded carefully under my arm, I was already planning our next flying session. That kite became one of my favourite possessions, not because it was expensive or fancy, but because it had taught me something important about persistence and the joy that comes from finally mastering something difficult. Every time the wind picked up after that day, I'd beg my dad to take me back to the field so we could send our diamond-shaped friend dancing across the sky again. That story is over. There's something so pure about the moment when a kid finally gets their kite to fly after struggling with it. And Naomi perfectly captured that magical feeling of being connected to something soaring high above through just a string and determination. The patience of parents who understand that some victories are worth working for, and the joy of that first successful flight, reminds us that the best accomplishments often come after multiple attempts and gentle guidance. This next story comes from someone who found magic in the simplest of things. The sound of chalk on the driveway. I remember being maybe 6 or 7 years old, and there was something absolutely magical about that scratchy sound chalk made against the concrete of our driveway. Every single day after school, I'd grab whatever pieces of sidewalk chalk I could find and just start creating. I'd draw these elaborate hopscotch grids that stretched from the garage all the way down to the street, with numbers that got more and more crooked the further I went. But it wasn't just hopscotch. I'd spend hours drawing everything I could think of. Rainbow houses with triangle roofs and square windows, stick figure families with huge smiles, cats that looked more like circles with legs, flowers that were just stems with colourful blobs on top. Sometimes I'd try to draw my name in fancy letters, though the S's always came out looking like snakes, and the other letters never quite lined up right. The best part was how the chalk dust would get all over my hands and knees. I'd be covered in pink and blue and yellow powder by the time I was done. And my mum would always shake her head when I came inside looking like I'd been wrestling with a rainbow. She'd make me wash my hands twice before dinner, scrubbing at the stubborn chalk residue under my fingernails. I remember one particular afternoon when I decided to draw this massive sun right in the centre of the driveway. I used every piece of yellow chalk we had, making the rays stretch out in all directions. It took me hours to finish, and I was so proud of it. I kept running inside to drag my parents out to see my masterpiece, pointing at each ray like I'd discovered fire or invented the wheel. But then the next morning, I woke up to the sound of rain against my bedroom window. I pressed my face to the glass and watched the water streaming down the driveway, carrying away all my hard work in colourful rivers. The hopscotch grid disappeared first, then the stick figure family, and finally my beautiful sun, washing away like it had never existed at all. I remember feeling this strange mix of sadness and fascination as I watched it all disappear. It was heartbreaking to see hours of work just vanish, but there was something oddly satisfying about the clean slate the rain had left behind. By the time the storm passed, the driveway was grey and empty again, waiting for the next round of chalk masterpieces. And sure enough, as soon as the concrete dried, I was back out there with a fresh piece of chalk, ready to start all over again. Because that was the thing about chalk drawings. They weren't meant to last forever. They were temporary magic, beautiful for a moment, and then gone, making room for whatever came next. That story hits different, because there's something so pure about finding joy in something as simple as chalk on concrete. The cycle of creating, losing it to the rain, and starting fresh the next day is like the perfect metaphor for childhood itself. Everything felt so important and magical, even when it was destined to wash away. Let's move on to our next story, which comes from someone named Mason, who had a very specific summer goal. The tree I tried to climb every summer. There was this massive oak tree in our backyard that became my personal Mount Everest every single summer. I'm talking about a tree that was probably 100 years old, with a trunk so thick that 3 kids holding hands couldn't wrap their arms around it. The bark was rough and deeply grooved, perfect for gripping, and the lowest branch hung about 8 feet off the ground. Every year, from the time I was about 5 until I was probably 12, I made it my mission to conquer that tree. I'd spend entire afternoons circling it like a predator, studying the bark patterns, looking for the perfect foothold or handhold that would finally give me the boost I needed to reach that first branch. I was convinced that if I could just make it to that lowest branch, the rest of the tree would be easy. I tried everything. I'd back up and take running leaps, hoping momentum would carry me high enough to grab hold of something. I'd stack up lawn chairs and old buckets, creating these precarious towers that would inevitably collapse the moment I put my full weight on them. I even convinced my dad to give me a boost a few times, but he'd only lift me so high before declaring it too dangerous and lowering me back down. The closest I ever came was during the summer when I was 10. I'd been working out, if you could call doing jumping jacks in the living room working out, and I felt stronger than ever. I found this perfect little groove in the bark about 3 feet up, and I managed to wedge my sneaker into it and actually pull myself up a few inches. For a glorious moment, I thought I was going to make it. I could see that branch getting closer, and I started planning which limb I'd climb to next. But then my arms gave out, and I slid back down the trunk, getting a nice case of bark burn on my palms and forearms. I sat at the base of that tree for probably 20 minutes, just staring up at that impossible branch and plotting my next attempt. My parents used to joke that I was more persistent than a woodpecker, always coming back to that same tree day after day. They'd see me out there through the kitchen window, jumping and stretching, and occasionally talking to the tree like it might suddenly decide to help me out. Mum would call me in for lunch covered in bark dust and tree sap, with grass stains on my knees from all the times I'd fallen. The funny thing is, I never actually made it past that lowest branch, not once, but somehow that didn't matter. That tree represented this incredible challenge, this mountain that existed right there in my own backyard. Every summer, it was waiting for me, unchanged and unimpressed by my growth spurts or my new sneakers or my increasingly elaborate climbing strategies. Even now, whenever I drive past my childhood home, I always look for that oak tree. It's still there, still massive, still impossible, and that lowest branch still looks about 8 feet off the ground, still mocking every kid who thinks they can reach it. But you know what? I bet there's some new kid living in that house now, circling that tree and planning their own assault on that first branch. Because that's what childhood is all about, isn't it? Having these impossible dreams and throwing yourself at them with complete conviction, even when logic tells you it's never going to happen. That tree taught me more about persistence and determination than any adult ever could have. Mason never conquered his tree, but honestly, that's what makes this story so perfect. Sometimes the goal isn't about actually achieving the thing, it's about having something to reach for. That tree was his personal Everest, and the fact that he kept trying year after year shows the kind of pure determination that only exists in childhood. Our next story comes from Harper, who discovered something magical at the county fair. The first time I tried cotton candy, I was 7 years old at our town's annual county fair, walking between the spinning rides and game booths with my dad, when I saw something that looks like pink clouds being spun out of thin air. There was this man in a white apron standing behind what looks like a metal bowl, holding a paper cone, and somehow wrapping wisps of pink sugar around it, like he was performing magic. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. The cotton candy looked like something that shouldn't exist in the real world, like fairy food, or something you'd see in a dreamed light. And it was impossibly fluffy, and colour was this perfect carnival pink that matched the sunset, starting to paint the sky behind the Ferris wheel. I tugged on my dad's sleeve and pointed at the cotton candy stand, not even sure what I was asking for, because I didn't know what that magical pink stuff was called. The man behind the counter was spinning cone after cone, and each one looked like a miniature pink cloud that defied gravity. Kids were walking around with these giant puffs of sweetness, and they all had this look of pure wonder on their faces. My dad bought me my very first cone of cotton candy, and I remember holding it like it was made of soap bubbles, afraid that if I gripped too tight or moved too fast, it would just disappear. The texture was unlike anything I'd ever touched. It looked solid from a distance, but up close it was all these tiny threads of spun sugar creating this impossibly light structure. The first bite was a revelation. I expected it to be chewy or crunchy, but the moment it touched my tongue, it just melted away into pure sweetness. It was like eating a cloud made of sugar, dissolving instantly and leaving behind this concentrated burst of flavour that was somehow both intense and subtle at the same time. I couldn't believe that something so substantial looking could disappear so completely in my mouth. I spent the next 10 minutes eating that cotton candy in the most careful, methodical way possible, one melt on my tongue, pulling off tiny pieces and letting each I wanted to make it last forever, because I was convinced this was the most magical food that had ever been invented. My fingers got sticky with the residual sugar, and by the time I was done, my face was probably pink around the edges from where I'd gotten too eager with the bigger pieces. But the best part wasn't even the taste. It was watching my dad watch me experience something completely new. He had this smile on his face, like he was remembering his own first time trying cotton candy. Or maybe he was just enjoying seeing the world through my 7-year-old eyes where spun sugar could be actual magic. For years after that, every time we went to a fair or carnival, cotton candy was the first thing I'd ask for. It never quite recaptured that initial sense of wonder from the first time, but it always brought back that perfect evening when I discovered that someone had figured out how to spin sugar into clouds and sell them on a stick. Even now, whenever I smell that particular combination of sugar and carnival air, I'm right back to being 7 years old, holding a pink cloud and believing that magic was real and available for $2 at the county fair. That story captures something so beautiful about childhood, how the simplest things could feel like pure magic. Cotton candy is just spun sugar, but to a 7-year-old experiencing it for the first time, it might as well have been actual fairy food. There's something heartbreaking and wonderful about how intensely kids can experience joy from things we adults barely notice anymore. Moving on to our next memory, this one comes from Leo, who had a very specific morning routine. The morning cartoons before school. Every single school day, I would set my alarm for exactly 6:30 in the morning, not because I was some kind of early riser or because I needed extra time to get ready, but because that gave me exactly 30 minutes to watch cartoons before anyone else in the house woke up. Those 30 minutes were absolutely sacred to me. I'd creep downstairs in my pajamas, careful to avoid the creaky step, third from the bottom, that would wake up my parents, and I'd flip on the television with the volume turned way down low. I had this whole system figured out, where I'd already have my cereal bowl and spoon laid out on the coffee table the night before, so all I had to do was pour the milk and grab my favourite cereal from the pantry. The house was completely quiet except for the soft sounds of whatever cartoon was playing and the gentle crunching of my cereal. It felt like I had discovered this secret pocket of time that belonged entirely to me. Before the chaos of getting ready for school, and my parents rushing around, and my little sister demanding attention for whatever crisis she'd invented that morning. I had my shows perfectly timed out. There was this one cartoon that came on at exactly 6:30, and I knew that if the characters were doing their closing theme song, I had about 5 minutes before I needed to start thinking about getting dressed. It was like having my own personal schedule that revolved entirely around animated adventures and sugary cereal. The best mornings were when my favourite show would have a special episode, or when they'd show 2 episodes back to back. I'd sit there in my Spider-Man pyjamas, spooning cereal into my mouth and completely absorbed in whatever was happening on screen. Sometimes I'd laugh out loud at the funny parts, then immediately clap my hand over my mouth, terrified that I'd wake someone up and lose my precious cartoon time. I remember the specific way the morning light would come through our living room windows, creating these long rectangles of sunshine across the carpet. The house smelled like sleep and quiet, and there was something so peaceful about being the only one awake while the rest of the world was still sleeping. It felt like I was getting away with something, even though watching cartoons wasn't against any rules. The spell would always break when I'd hear my mum's footsteps upstairs, signalling that the adult world was about to intrude on my cartoon sanctuary. I'd quickly finish whatever was left in my cereal bowl, rinse it out in the kitchen sink, and race upstairs to get dressed before anyone realised I'd been up for the past 30 minutes, living my best life in front of the television. Even on weekends, when I could theoretically sleep in and watch cartoons for hours, it never felt quite the same. There was something special about those stolen morning moments when the cartoons felt like a secret reward for being disciplined enough to wake up early and responsible enough to not wake anyone else. Looking back, those 30 minutes of morning cartoons were probably the most peaceful part of my entire day. Once school started, everything became schedules and homework and social dynamics and all the complicated stuff that comes with being a kid trying to figure out the world. But those early morning cartoon sessions were pure uncomplicated joy. Now I understand why my parents never seemed to mind that I was watching television first thing in the morning. They probably appreciated having an extra 30 minutes of sleep, and they knew I was being quiet and taking care of myself. Plus, there are definitely worse ways for a kid to start their day than with a bowl of cereal and some harmless cartoon adventures. Leo's morning cartoon ritual is such a perfect example of how kids create these magical routines for themselves. The dedication to wake up early just for 30 minutes of pure, uninterrupted cartoon time shows the kind of priorities that only make sense in childhood. There's something so sweet about him being careful not to wake anyone up, turning those quiet morning moments into his own private sanctuary. Let's continue with our next story from Ava, who has a memory that perfectly captures the essence of fall. The autumn leaves pile. Every October, when the giant maple tree in our front yard would start dropping its leaves, my dad and I had this tradition that I looked forward to more than Halloween or my birthday or practically anything else that happened during the fall. We'd wait until the weekend when the tree had shed most of its golden and orange and red leaves, creating this massive carpet across our entire front yard. My dad would get out the old metal rake, the one with a few bent tines that he'd been using since before I was born, and I'd follow him around with my own tiny plastic rake that was decoration, probably more than functional tool. But the real magic happened when we'd finished raking. After spending what felt like hours gathering every single leaf into these enormous piles that reached almost to my waist, my dad would step back, wipe his forehead with the back of his hand, and give me this look that said it was time for the best part. I'd back up about 10 feet from the biggest pile, take a running start, and launch myself into the centre with absolutely no regard for how I'd land. The leaves would explode around me in this shower of gold and orange, and I'd disappear completely into the pile for a moment before popping my head up like some kind of autumn woodland creature. The smell is what I remember most vividly, that earthy, slightly musty scent of decomposing leaves mixed with the crisp October air. It was the smell of fall concentrated into one perfect moment. I'd burrow deeper into the pile, making leaf angels and throwing handfuls of leaves into the air above me, watching them flutter down like confetti. My dad would always join in eventually. He'd pretend to be very serious about his raking duties until I'd grab him by the arm and drag him toward the pile. Then he'd do this exaggerated leap that was somehow both graceful and ridiculous, landing with a tremendous crash that sent leaves flying in every direction. We'd both emerge with leaves stuck in our hair and clothing, laughing until our stomachs hurt. Sometimes we'd rebuild the pile just so we could jump in it again. Other times we'd have leaf fights, scooping up armfuls and tossing them at each other until we were both completely covered from head to toe. My mum would watch from the front porch, shaking her head but smiling, knowing that she'd have to help us get all the leaves out of our hair before dinner. The best part was that no matter how carefully we'd rake those leaves into perfect piles, by the time we were done playing, they'd be scattered across the yard again, like we'd never cleaned up at all. But that was okay, because the point was never really about having a perfectly manicured lawn. The point was having an excuse to play together and celebrate the fact that our tree had given us this incredible playground made entirely of autumn. Even now, whenever October rolls around and I see families raking leaves in their yards, I want to tell them to stop worrying about bagging everything up and just jump in the piles. because those perfect moments of pure joy don't come around very often, and they're definitely worth getting a few leaves in your hair. That story ends there, and honestly, there's something so perfect about a dad who understood that the best part of raking leaves isn't the clean yard afterward. It's the explosion of joy that happens when you dive headfirst into your hard work. Ava's memory captures that magical balance between responsibility and play that makes childhood so special. Our next story comes from someone who learned about letting go in the most bittersweet way possible. The birthday balloon that floated away. I was turning 6 years old, and my mum had gotten me this absolutely perfect helium balloon for my birthday party. It wasn't just any balloon, it was one of those special foil ones shaped like the number 6, all shiny and silver, and catching the light in this amazing way that made it look almost magical. The balloon had been tied to my wrist with this bright red ribbon during the entire party. I kept lifting my arm up and watching it bob and dance above my head, feeling like I had captured a little piece of the sky. All my friends kept commenting on how cool it was, and I felt so proud walking around with this floating number, announcing to the world that I was officially 6 years old. After all the guests had gone home, and we'd cleaned up the wrapping paper and put away the leftover cake, I was sitting on our front porch steps, still wearing my birthday crown and still attached to my special balloon. My mum was inside doing dishes, and my dad was putting folding chairs back in the garage, and I was just enjoying the quiet after all the birthday excitement. That's when I made the mistake that still haunts me decades later. I was fiddling with the ribbon, wrapping it around my fingers and unwrapping it, when somehow it slipped right out of my grasp. I watched in absolute horror as my beautiful silver number 6 began floating away from me, rising slowly at first, then catching a breeze and moving faster. I jumped up from the porch steps and started chasing the balloon down the sidewalk, reaching up toward the sky like I could somehow will it back down to me. But it was already too high, drifting over the neighbour's house and continuing to climb higher and higher into the afternoon sky. I started crying immediately. Not the dramatic tantrum crying of a tired 6-year-old, but this deep, heartbroken sobbing because I knew I'd lost something that couldn't be replaced. My parents came running when they heard me, and my dad scooped me up and held me while I watched my balloon become smaller and smaller until it was just a tiny silver dot against the blue sky. My mum tried to comfort me by saying maybe he'd find it and be some other little kid would happy, or maybe it would float all the way to space and join the stars. But I was inconsolable because that balloon had been mine. It had been part of my perfect 6th birthday, and now it was gone forever because of my own carelessness. We stood there on the sidewalk for probably 15 minutes, watching that balloon until it completely disappeared into the clouds. My dad kept pointing to where we'd last seen it, even though there was nothing there anymore, and my mum kept running her fingers through my hair and telling me it was okay to be sad about losing something special. I learned later that my parents had actually bought me a backup balloon, just in case something happened to the first time they thought to mention it. I was already too attaché one, but by they'd to the specificated away. It wouldn't have been balloon that had flow the same balloon that had been tied to my wrist during my party, that had bobbed above my head while I blew out my candles. For weeks afterward, I would scan the sky whenever I was outside, hoping to spot a familiar silver glint that might be my balloon coming back home. I never saw it again, of course, but I never stopped looking. Even now, when I see helium balloons at parties, I always make sure to hold the ribbon extra tight, remembering that 6-year-old heartbreak of watching something precious float away, forever there, and wow, that story ends image of a 6-year-old chasing a balloon down the sidewalk while it floats away is absolutely heartbreaking. Sometimes our most vivid childhood memories come from moments of loss, when we first learned that some things can't be undone or retrieved. That balloon probably taught more about letting go than any adult conversation ever could. Let's move to a story from Clara, who discovered magic in her grandmother's backyard. The Fireflies week at our grandmother's house, in the country, in Grandma's backyard. Every summer, my cousins and I would spend and the absolute highlight of every single day was when the sun started setting and the fireflies would begin their nightly light show in her backyard. Grandma's yard was enormous compared to our suburban lawns back home, with this huge open space that stretched back toward a line of trees that seemed to go on forever. During the day, it was just grass and a few flower beds, but as soon as dusk started falling, it transformed into something that felt like a fairy tale. The fireflies would start blinking one by one, just tiny pinpricks of yellow-green light scattered across the darkening yard. But within minutes, there would be dozens of them, then hundreds, creating this incredible living constellation that danced and flickered all around us. It was like someone had taken stars and set them free to float through the air at eye level. My cousins and I had this whole system worked out for catching fireflies. We'd spread out across the yard with empty mason jars that Grandma had poked holes in the lids for, and we'd move slowly and carefully, trying not to scare them away. The trick was to watch for the flash, then cup your hands very gently around where you thought the firefly might land, hoping to trap it without hurting it. The feeling of having a firefly crawling around inside your cupped palms was incredible. You could feel these tiny little legs tickling your skin, and if you opened your hands just slightly, you'd see this magical glow pulsing between your fingers, like you were holding a piece of captured lightning. Sometimes we'd hold our hands up to our faces and peer through the cracks, watching the firefly's light illuminate the inside of our makeshift cage. But the best part was always letting them go. We'd open our hands completely and watch the firefly pause for just a moment, like it was getting its bearings before lifting off and rejoining the light show around us. There was something so satisfying about giving them back their freedom and watching them blink their way back into the darkness. My youngest cousin, Emma, was convinced that fireflies were actually tiny fairies, and she'd whisper little messages to each one before releasing it, asking them to take her wishes up to the stars. The rest of us were too old to believe in fairies, but we never corrected her because there was something magical about the way she'd cup a firefly close to her mouth and share her secrets with it before opening her hands. Grandma would sit on her back porch during our firefly hunts, sipping sweet tea and watching us run around her yard like we were conducting some kind of beautiful, glowing orchestra. Sometimes she'd call out tips about where the best catching spots were, or she'd warn us to be gentle with the little creatures that were putting on such a show for us. On the last night of each one Firefly and Hold 'em visit, we'd always have this tradition where we'd each catch all together in the centre of the yard. Then we'd count to 3 and release them all at the same time, watching our little group of lights scatter back into the larger light show. It felt like we were contributing something back to the magic that had entertained us all week. Years later, when I moved to the city and realised that fireflies don't really miss about something I'd lost without exist in urban environments, I felt this deep, so even knowing it, those summer evenings in Grandma's backyard, chasing tiny lights through the darkness with my cousins, represents some of the purest joy I've ever experienced. That story is over, and there's something so enchanting about kids discovering fireflies for the first time. Clara's memory captures that perfect childhood ability to find wonder in nature's simple, tricksist magic. The image of them all releasing their fireflies together on the last night feels like the perfect ending to a weak-captured star of light Ethan, who learned about. Our next story comes from Speed and Fear in equal measure. The sled ride down the big hill. There was this massive hill behind our neighbourhood that all the kids called Suicide Hill, which first warning that should have been my maybe this wasn't the safest place for an 8-year-old with a plastic sled and more courage than sense the thing about. But Suicide Hill was that it was absolutely irresistible to every kid in our neighbourhood. It was steep enough that you could see the entire town spread out below you when you stood at the top, and long enough that by the time you reached the bottom, you'd be going faster than you'd ever gone. In Remember the First Time My Older Brother Jake Your Life, I took me up there. I was clutching this bright red plastic sled that had seen better days, with a crack running down one side and the rope handle frayed from years of use. Jake kept telling me I didn't have to go down in front of him if I didn't want to, but there was no way I was backing and his friends, standing at the top of that hill, looking down at what seemed like a vertical drop into oblivion. I felt this incredible mix of terror and excitement. The snow was perfect that day, packed down smooth from all the other kids who'd been sledding, creating this icy track that disappeared around a bend about halfway down. Jake gave me this whole speech about steering out if things and how to bail went wrong, but honestly, off from the top, once you push of Suicide Hill, you were pretty much along for the ride. I positioned my sled at the edge, took a deep breath, and gave myself the smallest push forward. For the first few seconds, everything was fine. I was moving at a reasonable speed, feeling the cold air on my face and thinking this wasn't so scary after all. But then gravity really kicked in, and suddenly I was flying down that hill faster than I'd ever imagined possible. The trees on either side became blurs of brown and white, and the wind was so strong it made my eyes water uncontrollably. About halfway down, I hit a small bump that launched me, and the sled briefly into the air. For a terrifying moment, I thought I was going to separate from the sled entirely and tumble the rest of the way down the hill. But somehow, I managed to land back on it, though now I was going even faster and had absolutely no control over my direction. The worst part was realizing that the bottom of the hill ended at a fence, and I was approaching it at what felt like highway speed. I tried to remember Jake's instructions about steering, but the sled had a mind of its own, and my attempts to shift my weight only seemed to make me go faster. I finally bailed out about 20 feet from the fence, rolling off the sled and tumbling through the snow until I came to a stop in a tangled heap of limbs and winter clothing. My Esme Anlad continued on, without crashed into the fence with a loud crack that I was pretty sure meant it was broken forever. I lay there in the snow for a minute, taking inventory of my body parts and trying to catch my breath. Everything hurt, but in that good way that meant I was bruised but not actually damaged. I was covered head to toe in snow, and I could feel it melting down the back of my neck where it had gotten inside my coat. But as I stood up and brushed myself off, I felt this incredible rush of accomplishment. I had survived Suicide Hill. I had gone faster than I'd ever gone before, launched into the air, and lived to tell about it. When Jake and his friends came sliding down after me, I was grinning from ear to ear, despite my snow-covered face. We spent the rest of that afternoon taking turns on that hill, each ride feeling a little less terrifying and a little more exhilarating. By the end of the day, I was racing down headfirst on my stomach, whooping with joy as the world rushed past me in a blur of white and speed. That story ends there. And honestly, Suicide Hill sounds exactly like the kind of place that would give parents nightmares, but create the most vivid childhood memories. There's something so pure about that combination of terror and excitement, and the way Ethan describes that first ride captures perfectly how sometimes the best childhood experiences are the ones that scare us the most. Moving on to our next story from Zoe, who experienced one of childhood's greatest victories. The first gold star on my homework. I was in second grade, struggling with math in a way that made me feel like everyone else had been given some secret instruction manual that I'd somehow missed. While my classmates seemed to breeze through addition and subtraction worksheets, I'd sit there staring at rows of numbers like they were written in a foreign language. Mrs. Patterson was my teacher, and she had this system where she'd put different stickers on our homework depending on how well we'd done. Regular stickers meant you'd completed the work, silver stars meant you'd done well, but gold stars, those magical golden stars, were reserved for perfect papers, and I'd never gotten one. Every day when she handed back our math worksheets, I'd watch other kids get their gold stars and feel this sinking feeling in my stomach. I wasn't jealous exactly, but I desperately wanted to know what it felt like to be the kind of student who earned perfect scores. I'd study those gold stars on other kids' papers, wondering if they felt as special as they looked. I remember spending hours at our kitchen table with my mum, working through math problems until my eraser had worn holes in the paper from all my mistakes. She'd sit beside me with this incredible patience, explaining the same concepts over and over until something finally clicked in my brain. We'd go through practice worksheets she'd made herself, and slowly, very slowly, the numbers started making sense. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday in October. Mrs. Patterson had given us a worksheet with 20 addition problems, and for the first time ever, I felt confident as I worked through each one. Instead of panicking when I saw the numbers, I could actually visualize what they meant. 7 plus 5 became 7 dots in my head, plus 5 more dots, equaling 12 dots total. I double-checked every single answer before turning in my paper, counting on my fingers under my desk to make absolutely sure I hadn't made any careless mistakes. When I handed it to Mrs. Patterson, I felt this nervous excitement, like maybe, just maybe, this could be the one. The next day, when she started handing back our papers, I watched her approach my desk. With my heart pounding so hard, I was sure everyone could hear it. She placed my worksheet face down on my desk, just like always, and I took a deep breath before flipping it over. There, at the top of my paper in all its shiny golden glory, was a perfect star sticker. Not just any sticker, but one of those special gold ones that I'd been dreaming about for months. Next to it, Mrs. Patterson had written, "Excellent work, Zoe," in her neat handwriting, with a smiley face that somehow made the whole thing even more special. I stared at that gold star for probably a full minute, running my finger over it to make sure it was really there. It caught the light from the classroom windows and seemed to glow with its own special radiance. I felt this incredible surge of pride and accomplishment, like I'd just climbed Mount Everest or discovered a new planet. I couldn't wait to show my mum. The entire bus ride home, I kept pulling out my worksheet to look at that gold star, making sure it hadn't somehow fallen off or disappeared. When I burst through our front door, waving my paper in the air and shouting about my perfect score, my mum's face lit up with this enormous smile. She stuck my worksheet on the refrigerator with a magnet right at eye level, where everyone could see it. For weeks afterward, whenever people came over to our house, she'd point to my gold star and tell them how hard I'd worked to earn it. That little star became like a trophy, proof that I could succeed at something that had felt impossible just a few months earlier. Even now, decades later, I can still remember exactly how that gold star felt under my fingertip and the way it caught the light. It represented more than just a good grade. It was evidence that persistence and hard work could actually pay off, that the struggles I'd been having weren't permanent, and that sometimes the sweetest victories are the ones you have to fight the hardest to achieve. That story wraps up perfectly, and there's something so universally relatable about that first gold star moment. Zoe's struggle with math and then that incredible breakthrough captures how meaningful those small victories can be when you're a kid. The image of her running her finger over that star to make sure it was real is just beautiful. Let's continue with Oliver, who found magic in the most ordinary school supply, the smell of freshly sharpened pencils. Every August, right before school started, my mum would take me on this ritual shopping trip to get all my school supplies. We'd walk up and down the aisles of the store, checking items off the list my teacher had sent home. But the absolute best part was always the pencil aisle. There was something almost ceremonial about selecting a fresh box of number 2 pencils. I'd examine the different brands like I was choosing the tools that would carry me through the entire school year. Some had better erasers, others had smoother wood, but they all shared that same incredible potential energy, like they were just waiting to help me write the perfect essay or solve the most challenging math problem. But the real magic happened when we got home, and I'd sit at the kitchen table with my dad's old manual pencil sharpener, the heavy metal kind that clamped onto the edge of the table. I'd feed each pencil into that sharpener one by one, turning the handle slowly and listening to the satisfying scrape of wood and graphite being carved away. The smell that came from that sharpener was absolutely intoxicating. It was this perfect combination of cedar wood shavings and graphite dust, mixed with just a hint of metal from the sharpener blades. It smelled like possibility and fresh starts, and the promise of a new school year filled with opportunities to learn something amazing. I'd sharpen each pencil to an absolutely perfect point, then line them all up in a neat row across the table, admiring how uniform and ready they looked. 24 perfectly sharpened pencils, each one identical to the others, each one sharp enough to write the most precise letters and numbers. They looked like tiny yellow soldiers, all standing at attention and ready for duty. Or the smell would linger in the kitchen for hours afterward, and I'd find myself walking by just to catch another whiff of those wood shavings. It was like aromatherapy for students, this scent that somehow made me feel more organised and prepared and ready to tackle whatever challenges third grade might throw at me. I had this whole system worked out where I'd only use one pencil at a time, keeping the others safely stored in my pencil box, so they'd stay sharp and perfect for as long as possible. Every few days, I'd sharpen the one I was using, creating these tiny piles of wood shavings that I'd sometimes save in little containers because I loved the smell so much. My friends thought I was weird for being so obsessed with pencil sharpening, but there was something deeply satisfying about the process. The mechanical precision of the sharpener, the way the pencil would emerge with that perfect conical point, the immediate gratification of transforming something dull into something sharp and useful again. Even the sound was perfect, that rhythmic scraping as the blades carved away the wood, followed by the higher-pitched grinding when you hit the graphite core. I could tell by the sound when the pencil was perfectly sharpened, when that scraping noise shifted to a smoother tone that meant the point was complete. Years later, when schools switched to mechanical pencils and electric sharpeners, I felt like something essential had been lost. Those new tools were more efficient, sure, but they didn't have the ritual aspect, the hands-on involvement that made sharpening a pencil feel like preparing for something important. That story comes to an end there, and wow, Oliver managed to make pencil sharpening sound like a sacred ritual. There's something so beautifully obsessive about the way he describes that whole process, and honestly, the smell of freshly sharpened pencils really is one of those scents that can instantly transport you back to childhood. Sometimes the most ordinary things hold the most extraordinary memories. Our next story comes from Grace, who learned that sometimes the best adventures happen by accident. The time I lost my shoe in the mud, It had been raining for 3 days straight, turning our normally well-behaved backyard into this incredible landscape of puddles and mud that was absolutely irresistible to a 7-year-old who'd been stuck inside watching the downpour from the kitchen window. The moment the rain finally stopped, I begged my mum to let me go outside and explore what felt like a completely transformed world. She made me put on my oldest clothes and my bright yellow rain boots, the ones with the little ducks printed on the sides, and gave me strict instructions not to track mud into the house when I came back in. Our yard had become this amazing obstacle course of water and mud. There were puddles everywhere, some shallow enough to see the bottom, others deep enough that I couldn't tell how far down they went. The flower beds had turned into miniature swamps, and the area under our big oak tree was basically a small lake surrounded by the slickest, most tempting mud I'd ever seen. I started out being careful, stepping around the edges of puddles and trying to stay on the patches of grass that weren't completely waterlogged, but gradually the mud started calling to me. It looked so smooth and chocolate-coloured, and I kept wondering what it would feel like to squish between my fingers or sink my boots into it. The first few steps into the muddy area were fine. My rain boots kept my feet dry, and there was something incredibly satisfying about the way they made these perfect boot-shaped impressions in the soft earth. I felt like an explorer charting unknown territory, leaving my mark on this new landscape that the rain had created. But then I stepped into what looked like a shallow puddle and immediately sank much deeper than expected. The mud grabbed onto my right boot like it had hands, and when I tried to pull my foot back up, the boot stayed stuck while my sock-covered foot slipped right out of it. I stood there for a moment, balanced on one booted foot with my other foot bare and covered in mud, staring down at my yellow duck boot that was now completely swallowed by the earth. I tried reaching down to grab it, but every time I leaned over, I'd start to lose my balance and have to hop backward to keep from falling face first into the mud. The boot was really stuck. I could see just the very top of it poking out of the mud, like some kind of rubber plant that had sprouted in our backyard. I tried using a stick to dig around it, but that just seemed to make it sink deeper. I even tried using my other foot to stomp around it, thinking maybe I could create enough vibrations to loosen it up, but that just resulted in my second boot getting dangerously close to the same muddy trap. Finally, I accepted that my boot was gone, at least temporarily, and I started the long journey back to the house. Hopping on one foot while trying not to put my bare foot down in any of the remaining puddles turned out to be way harder than I'd expected. I felt like I was playing the world's muddiest game of hopscotch. Every few hops I'd have to stop and rest, balancing carefully while I planned out my next series of jumps. My remaining boot kept slipping on the wet grass, and more than once I had to windmill my arms wildly to keep from toppling over. I probably looked absolutely ridiculous, but I was giggling the entire time because the whole situation was so perfectly absurd. By the time I made it to the back porch, I was exhausted from all the hopping, covered in mud specks from my various near falls, and missing one boot entirely. My mum took one look at me through the kitchen window and started laughing so hard she had to sit down at the table. She helped me clean up, and then we went back out together with a garden shovel to conduct a proper rescue mission for my abandoned boot. It took both of us pulling together to finally extract it from the mud's grip, and when it finally came free with a satisfying pop, it was so caked with earth that you could barely see the yellow ducks anymore. That story ends there, and honestly, Grace's muddy boot adventure is such a perfect example of how the best childhood memories often come from things going completely wrong. The image of her hopping across the yard on one foot, trying to avoid more puddles while her boot stays trapped in the mud, is absolutely hilarious and somehow deeply relatable at the same time. Let's move to our next story from Caleb, who remembers the simple joy of beating the heat. The ice pops on the porch. Every summer afternoon when the temperature would hit that perfect point where even sitting still felt like work, my mum would appear on our front porch with this magical announcement that could make any day instantly better. She'd call out to wherever we kids had scattered around the neighbourhood, "Ice pops on the porch," and suddenly everyone would come running. She'd have this whole system worked out with a cooler full of those plastic tube ice pops, the ones that came in every colour imaginable and had flavours that didn't really correspond to anything found in nature. There was blue raspberry, which was somehow both sweet and tart at the same time, green apple that was more like liquid candy, red cherry that turned your tongue into a stop sign, and orange that was so artificially orange it made actual oranges seem pale by comparison. My siblings and I would race to be first in line, not because the flavours were dramatically different from each other, but because there was something special about being able to choose your own colour destiny for the next 10 minutes. I almost always went for blue because I loved how it would stain my lips and tongue, making me look like I'd been eating pure summer sky. We'd all claim our spots on the front porch steps, arranged like little soldiers in a rainbow army, each of us working on our chosen flavour with the kind of focus and determination usually reserved for much more important tasks. The key to eating an ice pop properly was finding the right balance between biting and sucking, trying to get the maximum flavour while avoiding the inevitable brain freeze that came from being too aggressive. But the real magic happened when the pops started melting faster than we could eat them. Those hot summer afternoons would turn our frozen treats into colourful rivers that would run down our arms, creating these temporary tattoos of sticky sweetness from our wrists all the way to our elbows. We'd try to catch the drips with our tongues, twisting our arms at impossible angles and making faces that probably looked ridiculous to any adults who happened to be watching. My little sister Emma had this technique where she'd try to eat around the edges first, creating these elaborate sculptural shapes before the heat inevitably won and turned her masterpiece into a puddle of blue or red or green. My older brother would always finish his first and then try to convince the rest of us to share, using his big brother powers of persuasion that worked about half the time. Sometimes we'd have races to see who could finish theirs first without getting brain freeze, or we'd compare whose tongue was the most dramatically coloured afterward. We'd stick our tongues out at each other like some kind of rainbow lizard convention, proud of our temporarily transformed mouths. The best part was when we were all done and would sit there on the porch steps, sticky and satisfied, watching the neighbourhood continue its summer afternoon routine while we enjoyed that perfect post-ice pop contentment. Our fingers would be stained with food colouring, our clothes would have new spots that would probably never come out, and we'd all be slightly hyper from the sugar rush. Mum would eventually appear with a wet washcloth and make us all line up for the de-stickification process, scrubbing at our hands and faces, while we squirmed and complained that we weren't that messy. But even the clean-up was part of the ritual. This transition from ice pop chaos back to regular summer afternoon activities. Looking back, those ice pops were probably 90% sugar water and food colouring, with maybe a hint of actual fruit flavour thrown in for good measure. But they represented something much more important than nutrition. They were these perfect little moments of relief and sweetness that could transform any hot, boring afternoon into something special and memorable. That story finishes there, and there's something so nostalgic about Caleb's ice pop memories. The way he describes those coloured rivers running down their arms and the rainbow lizard tongue comparisons is just perfect. Those cheap tube pops weren't much nutritionally, but they were everything emotionally, turning ordinary summer afternoons into these perfect little celebrations. Our next story comes from Isla, who discovered that some moments feel touched by something bigger than ourselves. The campfire that felt like magic. Every summer, my family would pack up our old station wagon and drive 3 hours north to this little lake where my uncle had a cabin. It wasn't fancy, just a one-room place with bunk beds and a kitchen that barely worked. But it had this incredible stone fire pit right down by the water's edge. On the last night of every trip, we'd have what my dad called the official send-off campfire. He'd spend the whole afternoon gathering the perfect logs, arranging them just right so they'd catch properly when the sun went down. My mum would make s'mores supplies, and my uncle would tune his old guitar, the one with the scratched wood and the missing tuner peg that he'd had since college. As darkness settled over the lake, we'd all gather around that fire pit wrapped in scratchy wool blankets that smelled like mothballs and old campfires. The flames would start small and orange, but as the night got darker, they seemed to grow taller and more alive, sending these incredible spirals of sparks up into the star-filled sky. I'd sit there mesmerised, watching those tiny points of light rise higher and higher until they disappeared into the darkness above us. It looked like the fire was having a conversation with the stars, sending messages up in sparkle code that only the night sky could understand. Sometimes I'd try to count the sparks as they floated upward, but there were always too many, and they moved too fast for my 8-year-old brain to keep track of. My uncle would start playing his guitar, nothing fancy, just these simple folk songs that seemed to fit perfectly with the crackling of the fire and the gentle lapping of lake water against the shore. His voice was rough and warm, and even though I didn't know most of the words, I'd hum along anyway, adding my own little harmony to the night music. The fire would shift and change as the logs burned down, creating these incredible patterns of flame and ember. Sometimes it would flare up suddenly when the wind caught it just right, illuminating all our faces in this golden glow that made everyone look like characters from a fairy tale. Other times, it would settle into a steady, hypnotic dance that could hold your attention for hours without you even realising time was passing. My dad would tell stories during these campfire sessions, usually about when he and my uncle were kids and would go camping with their grandfather. He'd talk about catching fireflies in mason jars and sleeping under the stars and waking up covered in dew. His voice would get soft and distant, like he was seeing those memories play out in the flames in front of us. But the most magical part was always when the fire started dying down to just glowing coals and my uncle would play one last song. The flames would be low enough that you could see the lake stretching out beyond us, perfectly still and reflecting the stars like a giant mirror. The whole world felt quiet and peaceful and connected in a way that made me believe that everything in the universe was exactly where it was supposed to be. I'd fall asleep right there on the log bench, wrapped in my blanket with the smell of wood smoke in my hair and the sound of gentle guitar music mixing with the soft conversations of the adults around me. Someone would eventually carry me inside to my bunk, but I'd always try to stay awake as long as possible because I knew that once the fire went out, the magic would be over for another year. Even now, whenever I smell wood smoke or hear an acoustic guitar, I'm right back at that lake, watching sparks rise into the darkness and feeling like I was part of something ancient and beautiful and eternal. Those campfire nights taught me that magic isn't just in fairy tales. It's in the moments when everything comes together perfectly and you realize you're experiencing something you'll remember forever. That story ends there, and honestly, Isla captured something so profound about those perfect campfire moments. There's something almost spiritual about watching sparks rise into a starlit sky while someone plays guitar nearby. Those nights when everything aligns perfectly and you feel connected to something bigger than yourself are the memories that stay with you forever. The image of her falling asleep to guitar music with wood smoke in her hair is just beautiful. Let's move to Daniel, who learned that the best discoveries are the ones you make with your closest friends. The secret shortcut through the woods. When I was 9, my best friends Tyler and Marcus and I were absolutely convinced that we had discovered something that no adult in the history of our town had ever found. We called it the secret shortcut, and we were certain we were the only 3 people in the world who knew it existed. The shortcut started behind the old Hendrick's house, where there was this gap in their back fence that was just wide enough for a skinny kid to squeeze through. From there, you'd follow what looked like a deer trail through about 50 yards of dense woods, ducking under low branches and stepping over fallen logs until you reached this incredible hidden creek that wasn't on any map we'd ever seen. Or the creek was maybe 3 feet wide and shallow enough that you could see smooth stones covering the bottom. It made this perfect babbling sound as it flowed over the rocks, and there were these tiny minnows that would dart away whenever you stepped too close to the water's edge. Following the creek downstream for another 100 yards would bring you out right behind the elementary school, cutting what was normally a 15-minute walk around the block into a 5-minute adventure. We'd discovered it completely by accident one Saturday afternoon when we were exploring behind Tyler's house and heard the sound of running water through the trees. Being naturally curious 9-year-olds, we'd pushed through the undergrowth to investigate and found ourselves standing on the banks of this magical little waterway that seemed to exist in its own secret world. From that day on, the secret shortcut became our private highway. We'd use it to get to school when we were running late, or to reach the playground on weekends, or just for the pure thrill of travelling through what felt like our own private wilderness. We'd developed this whole system of hand signals and whispered codes for navigating the trail, treating each trip like we were secret agents on a covert mission. The best part about the shortcut wasn't even the time it saved, it was the feeling of being explorers in our own neighbourhood. We'd pretend we were Lewis and Clark, mapping uncharted territory and discovering natural wonders that civilization hadn't touched yet. We'd give names to different landmarks along the way: the twisted oak, the rock that looks like a turtle, the fallen log bridge. Tyler always insisted on going first because he was the tallest and could push aside the branches for the rest of us. Marcus would bring his dad's old compass, even though we knew the route by heart, because it made the whole expedition feel more official. I usually carried the emergency supplies, which consisted of whatever snacks I could smuggle out of our kitchen, and a water bottle that was perpetually half empty. We'd spend entire summer afternoons just hanging out by that creek, skipping stones and looking for interesting rocks and debating whether we should tell other kids about our discovery. We always decided against it because sharing the secret would ruin what made it special. This was ours, our private piece of wilderness in the middle of suburbia. Sometimes we'd encounter other evidence of life along the trail, a discarded soda can that made us feel like detectives investigating clues. Animal tracks in the mud near the creek that we'd try to identify using a nature guide. Tyler had checked out from the library. Once we found what we were convinced was an arrowhead, though it probably was just an unusually sharp piece of broken glass. The shortcut served us faithfully through 4th grade and into 5th, until the day we arrived to find that someone had repaired the gap in the Hendrick's fence. We stood there, staring at the new boards, feeling like someone had locked the door to our private kingdom. We tried finding other ways into the woods, but nothing felt the same as our original secret entrance. Years later, I learned that plenty of other kids had known about that trail, and that adults in the neighborhood were well aware of the creek and the informal path that kids had been using for decades. But somehow, that doesn't diminish the magic of thinking we were the first explorers to chart that particular course through the woods. The secret shortcut taught us that discovery isn't always about finding something truly new. It's about the joy of exploration and the bond that forms when you share adventures with your best friends. We may not have been the first kids to walk that trail, but we were the first Tyler, Marcus and Daniel to make it ours. That story ends there, and there's something so perfectly childhood about Daniel and his friends thinking they were the only ones who knew about this trail that probably dozens of kids had used before them. The sense of ownership and adventure they felt, complete with hand signals and secret codes, captures that beautiful childhood ability to turn the ordinary into something magical. Sometimes the best discoveries are the ones that make you feel like an explorer, even if you're just walking through your own neighborhood. Moving on to Lily, who learned that sometimes the best adventures happen when nothing fits quite right. The raincoat 2 sizes too big. My older brother Jake had outgrown his bright yellow raincoat, and instead of throwing it away, my mum decided it would be perfect for me. Never mind that Jake was 6 years older and about twice my size. In her mind, a raincoat was a raincoat, and I'd grow into it eventually. The first time she made me wear it to school, I felt like I was being swallowed alive by a giant yellow marshmallow. The sleeves hung past my fingertips by at least 6 inches, and the bottom of the coat reached almost to my ankles. The hood was so big that when I pulled it up, it would slide forward and cover my entire face, leaving me stumbling around blind and bumping into things. But you know what? That ridiculously oversized raincoat became my favourite piece of clothing in the entire world. There was something magical about being completely enveloped in waterproof yellow fabric, like I was wearing my own personal tent that I could take anywhere. When it rained, I was invincible. I'd roll up the sleeves as many times as I could, but they'd always unroll themselves and flop back down over my hands, so I learned to adapt, using the extra fabric, like built-in mittens when I needed to grab something, or letting the sleeves hang loose and pretend I was some kind of yellow-winged creature flapping through the rain. The best part about that enormous raincoat was how it transformed puddle jumping from a cautious activity into an extreme sport. With all that coverage, I could splash through any puddle without worrying about getting my regular clothes wet underneath. I felt like I was wearing a full-body shield against the elements, free to be as reckless as I wanted with water. I'd spend entire rainy afternoons stomping through every puddle in our neighbourhood, watching the water splash up against the yellow fabric and roll right off like I was made of rubber. Other kids would tiptoe carefully around puddles, trying to keep their shoes dry, while I'd march straight through the middle of everyone I could find. My friends thought I looked absolutely ridiculous in that coat, and they were probably right. I looked like a tiny person wearing a tent, or maybe like I'd been inflated with helium and was about to float away. But I didn't care because I felt invincible and adventurous and completely protected from whatever weather the sky wanted to throw at me. The hood situation was particularly entertaining. When it was windy, the oversized hood would catch air like a sail, and I'd have to hold it down to keep from being pulled backward. When it wasn't windy, the hood would flop over my eyes randomly, creating these moments of complete darkness that turned walking into an obstacle course. Sometimes I'd pull the hood all the way forward on purpose and try to navigate by sound alone, shuffling slowly down the sidewalk, with my arms outstretched like a yellow-coated zombie. I'd listen for cars and footsteps and voices, trying to map out my surroundings without being able to see anything. My mum would watch me from the kitchen window, probably wondering if she'd made a mistake giving me that coat, but also probably enjoying how much happiness I was getting from something so simple. I'd come inside after my rainy adventures completely soaked from the knees down, but with my torso perfectly dry thanks to my ridiculous yellow armour. That raincoat lasted me 3 years, and even when I finally started growing into it a little bit, I was sad to see the sleeves getting shorter and the bottom hem rising up toward my knees. By the time it actually fit properly, it had lost most of its magical properties and just felt like regular outerwear. I learned something important from that oversized raincoat. Sometimes the things that don't fit quite right are the ones that fit your imagination perfectly. That coat was too big for my body, but it was exactly the right size for adventure. That story comes to an end there, and honestly, Lily's relationship with that enormous raincoat is just delightful. The image of her marching through puddles while other kids tiptoe around them, completely fearless in her yellow tent coat, captures something so beautiful about childhood resilience and imagination. Sometimes the hand-me-downs that seem all wrong turn out to be exactly what we need for the best adventures. Let's continue with Jonah, who discovered that perfection isn't always about getting everything exactly right. The first snowman I built, I was 6 years old the first time I ever saw enough snow to build something with it. We lived in North Carolina, where snow was more like a rumour than an actual weather event, so when I woke up to find our entire yard covered in 3 inches of white powder, it felt like Christmas morning, and my birthday rolled into one. My mum bundled me up in so many layers that I could barely move my arms, then pushed me out the back door with instructions to have fun, but not to eat the snow, because who knew what was in it. I stood on our back porch for a full minute, just staring at this transformed landscape that had been our regular boring yard the night before. I'd seen snowmen in movies and on Christmas cards, but I'd never actually attempted to construct one myself. I had this vague idea that you were supposed to roll snow into balls, but the logistics of how that actually worked were completely mysterious to me. I started by scooping up handfuls of snow and trying to pat them together, but they kept crumbling apart in my mittened hands. After about 10 minutes of failed attempts to make the snow stick together, I discovered that if I rolled a small ball along the ground, it would pick up more snow and gradually get bigger. This seemed like the most amazing scientific discovery in the history of the world, and I spent the next hour perfecting my snow rolling technique. My first snowball started out about the size of a tennis ball, but by the time I was done rolling it around the yard, it was almost as big as a beach ball. I was so proud of this accomplishment that I called my mum out to witness my snow rolling mastery. She made appropriate impressed noises and suggested I might want to make 2 more balls to stack on top. The second ball was supposed to be smaller than the first, but I got carried away with the rolling process and it ended up being almost exactly the same size. The third ball, which was supposed to be the head, started out appropriately small, but somehow grew to be nearly as large as the other 2. By the time I was ready to start stacking, I had 3 giant snowballs that were all roughly the same diameter. Lifting the second ball onto the first one required help from my dad, who had come outside to see what all the excitement was about. Together we managed to hoist it up, but it immediately started sliding sideways because the bottom ball wasn't flat enough to provide a stable base. The whole structure had this precarious lean that made it look like it was about to topple over at any moment. Adding the third ball, the head, made the situation even more unstable. We had to prop it up with sticks to keep it from rolling off entirely. The finished product looked less like a traditional snowman and more like 3 large snowballs having a group hug while slowly falling over together. For the face, I used rocks from our garden border, but I couldn't find 3 rocks that were the same size. So the eyes were mismatched, and the mouth was just one large stone positioned roughly where a mouth should be. We didn't have a carrot for the nose, so I used a stick which gave him this strange Pinocchio appearance. The arms were 2 branches from our oak tree, but they were different lengths and stuck out at odd angles, making the snowman look like he was shrugging with one shoulder while pointing with the other. My dad found an old baseball cap to put on top, but the head was so round that the cap just sat there, like a tiny hat on a giant bowling ball. Standing back to admire my creation, I knew it was the most lopsided, unstable, oddly proportioned snowman that had ever been built in our yard. But I also knew it was absolutely perfect because it was mine. I'd rolled every inch of snow myself, chosen every rock and stick personally, and somehow managed to stack 3 heavy balls of snow without the whole thing completely falling apart. My mum took probably 20 pictures of me standing next to my crooked snowman, and I insisted on going outside every few hours to check on him and make sure he was still standing. He lasted exactly 2 days before the North Carolina sun melted him into a sad pile of sticks and rocks. But for those 48 hours, he was the most magnificent snow creature in the entire neighborhood. I learned something important from that first snowman. It doesn't matter if your creation looks exactly like what you had in mind. What matters is the joy you get from making it and the pride you feel when you step back and say, I built that. That story wraps up there, and there's something so endearing about Jonah's completely lopsided snowman that looked like 3 snowballs having a group hug. The fact that all 3 sections ended up the same size and the whole thing was held up with sticks makes it sound like the most charmingly chaotic snowman ever built. Sometimes the projects that turn out completely different from what we planned are the ones we remember most fondly. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that magic could be written in the air with fire. The summer nights with sparklers. Every 4th of July, after the official fireworks display, downtown had ended and all the families were packing up their blankets and folding chairs. Our neighborhood would have its own private celebration in the Johnsons' backyard. Mr. Johnson would appear from his garage carrying this enormous box of sparklers, the long kind that burned for what felt like forever and threw off these incredible showers of golden sparks. He'd hand them out to all the kids like he was distributing magic wands, giving us these serious instructions about holding them away from our bodies and not pointing them at anyone else. But once those sparklers were lit and we had our own personal fireworks in our hands, all the safety lectures disappeared into the summer night air. I remember the first time I held a lit sparkler, watching these tiny meteors shoot out from the end in perfect arcs of light. It felt like holding a piece of the sun, this concentrated burst of celebration that I could control and direct wherever I wanted. The sparks would fly out about 6 inches from the tip, creating these beautiful trails of light that hung in the air for just a moment before fading away. The best part was discovering that you could write with sparklers, drawing letters and shapes in the darkness that would appear briefly like glowing graffiti against the night sky. I'd spell out my name in careful cursive letters, watching each stroke appear and disappear in golden fire. The letters never looked quite right because it was impossible to write at a consistent speed, but there was something magical about seeing your name written in light. All the kids would spread out across the Johnsons' backyard, each of us creating our own light show with our sparklers. We'd draw hearts and stars and smiley faces, or just wave them around in wild patterns that created these abstract paintings made of fire. Sometimes we'd try to coordinate our movements, creating group masterpieces that lasted just long enough for everyone to see before disappearing forever. The older kids would get more adventurous, spelling out entire words or trying to draw elaborate pictures. My brother could write USA in perfect block letters, timing each stroke so that all 3 letters would be visible at the same time. I was always too impatient, starting the next letter before the previous one had faded, creating these overlapping messes of light that looked nothing like what I'd intended. When the sparklers got down to the last few inches, they'd burn hotter and faster, creating these intense bursts of sparks that meant it was almost time to drop them in the bucket of sand that Mr. Johnson had set up for disposal. That final flare-up was always the most dramatic part, like the sparkler was using up all its remaining energy in one spectacular finale. The smell of burnt sparklers would linger in the air long after the last one had been extinguished. This metallic, smoky scent that somehow perfectly captured the essence of summer celebration. We'd all stand around comparing notes about what we'd drawn, trying to describe the letters and pictures we'd created, even though they'd all disappeared into the darkness. After all the sparklers were gone, we'd sit in the grass looking up at the real stars, our eyes still adjusting from staring at all that artificial light. The contrast made the stars seem dimmer at first, but gradually they'd come back into focus, and we'd try to trace constellations with our fingers the same way we'd been drawing with fire just minutes before. Years later, whenever I see sparklers at celebrations, I'm right back in the Johnsons' backyard, carefully spelling my name in golden light and feeling like I'd been given the power of the night sky. Those summer to paint evenings taught me that some of the most beautiful art is the kind that disappears the moment you create it, existing only in memory and in the joy of making it. That story ends there, and there's something so perfectly nostalgic about writing your name in sparkler light against a summer night sky. The idea of all those kids spread across the backyard, each creating their own temporary masterpieces in golden fire, captures the pure magic of those childhood 4th of July celebrations. Sometimes the most beautiful art is the kind that exists for just a moment before disappearing forever. Let's move to Owen, who experienced one of nature's gentlest miracles firsthand. The first time I held a baby chick. My 2nd grade class took a field trip to Morrison Farm every spring, and it was always the highlight of our entire school year. The bus ride took forever, winding through countryside that seemed impossibly green and open compared to our suburban neighbourhood. But the anticipation was worth it, because Morrison Farm had baby animals, and Mrs. Morrison always let each kid hold a newly hatched chick. We'd gather around this large wooden pen where dozens of tiny yellow chicks were peeping and stumbling around on legs that seemed too long for their fuzzy bodies. They moved in this adorable, unsteady way, like they were still figuring out how their feet worked. Every few seconds, one would topple over and then pop back up, completely unfazed by the temporary loss of balance. Mrs. Morrison would carefully reach into the pen and select a chick, explaining how we needed to be very gentle because they were only a few days old. She'd demonstrate the proper way to hold one, creating a little cup with both hands so the chick would feel secure and wouldn't accidentally fall. Then she'd place the tiny creature in the first student's hands, and we'd all hold our breath watching this delicate transfer. When it was finally my turn, Mrs. Morrison placed the softest, warmest little ball of fluff into my cupped palms. I was amazed by how light it was, like holding a cotton ball that happened to be alive and moving. The chick's tiny feet tickled my skin as it tried to find its balance, and I could feel its rapid heartbeat through the downy feathers. The chick's eyes were like tiny black beads, bright and alert, and somehow wise despite being attached to something so small and vulnerable. It would cock its head to one side, then the other, studying my face with what seemed like genuine curiosity. Every few seconds it would open its beak and let out the tiniest peep, a sound so soft and pure that it made everyone around me smile automatically. The most incredible thing was how warm the chick felt in my hands. It was like holding a tiny furnace wrapped in the softest material imaginable. The warmth seemed to radiate up through my fingers and arms, creating this feeling of connection with something completely innocent and new to the world. I wanted to protect it and keep it safe from anything that might harm something so small and perfect. I held that chick for maybe 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. I was completely absorbed in studying every detail of this miniature miracle, from the perfect yellow fluff that covered its entire body to the tiny orange beak that was already perfectly shaped despite belonging to something that had just hatched a few days earlier. Its feet were the most delicate things I'd ever seen, with tiny claws that gripped gently at my fingers. The chick seemed completely calm in my hands, not struggling to escape or showing any signs of fear. It would occasionally shift its weight from one foot to the other, or turn its head to look at something that had caught its attention. But mostly, it just sat there contentedly, like my cupped palms were the most natural place in the world for it to be. When Mrs. Morrison said it was time to pass the chick to the next student, I felt genuinely sad to let it go. There was something about that brief connection with something so young and trusting that made me want to stay in that moment forever. I carefully transferred the chick to my classmate's hands, making sure it was secure before letting go completely. For the rest of the field trip, I kept looking back at that pen of chicks, trying to spot the one I'd held and wondering if it remembered me too. All the chicks looked identical, but I was convinced I could pick out mine from the crowd based on some subtle detail that only I would notice. The bus ride back to school was unusually quiet because we were all processing the magic of holding something so new and alive. I kept looking at my hands, still feeling the phantom warmth of that tiny chick and trying to memorize exactly how it had felt to be trusted with something so precious and fragile. That story comes to an end, and honestly, Owen's description of holding that story comes to an end. And honestly, Owen's description of holding that baby chick is just beautiful. There's something so profound about being trusted with something that tiny and vulnerable, feeling its heartbeat through the downy feathers and experiencing that pure warmth in your palms. The way he describes wanting to protect something so innocent and new to the world captures that special responsibility kids feel when they encounter baby animals for the first time. Moving on to Sophia, who learned that sometimes the best views come with a price, the Ferris wheel at the county fair. I was 8 years old and had been begging my parents to let me ride the Ferris wheel all afternoon, but they kept saying I was too young. That may be next year when I was bigger. I'd been watching it slowly turn all day, these colourful gondolas rising high into the air and giving riders what looked like the most amazing view of the entire fairgrounds. Finally, after what felt like hours of pleading and promising to be brave, my dad agreed to ride with me. We waited in line behind families and couples, and I kept craning my neck upward to see just how high this thing actually went. From ground level, it looked tall but manageable. The people in the gondolas looked small but not impossibly far away. The operator was this weathered man who looked like he'd been running carnival rides for decades. He helped us into our gondola with practiced efficiency, lowering a safety bar across our laps and giving it a firm shake to make sure it was locked. The seats were hard metal painted bright red, and they rocked slightly as we settled in. For the first few seconds, the ride felt gentle and pleasant. We rose slowly, maybe 10 feet off the ground, and I could see over the tops of the game booths and food stands. The view was actually pretty cool, and I started feeling proud of myself for being brave enough to try something new. This wasn't so scary after all, but then we kept going up and up and up some more. What had looked like a reasonable height from the ground suddenly felt like we were ascending to the moon. The people below us shrunk to the size of ants, and the entire fairground spread out like a miniature model village. I could see our car in the parking lot, looking like a toy someone had dropped among hundreds of other tiny vehicles. About halfway to the top, my stomach started doing things I'd never experienced before. It wasn't just butterflies, it was like my internal organs had decided to rearrange themselves without asking my permission. Every time our gondola swayed even slightly in the breeze, I was convinced we were about to plummet to earth in a twisted heap of metal and screaming. The worst part came when we reached the very top and the Ferris wheel stopped to let other passengers board at the bottom. We just sat there, suspended what felt like 1,000 feet in the air, with nothing but a thin metal bar keeping us from falling to our doom. The gondola rocked gently back and forth, and I gripped the safety bar so tightly that my knuckles turned white. From up there, I could see everything. The entire town spread out in all directions, roads leading off to places I'd never been, houses and buildings looking like a detailed map come to life. It should have been beautiful and exciting, but I was too terrified to appreciate the view. All I could think about was how impossibly far we were from solid ground. My dad kept trying to point out interesting sights, talking about how amazing the view was, and asking if I could see our house in the distance, but his voice sounded far away and tinny, like he was speaking through a tunnel. I managed to nod and make appropriate sounds, but inside I was calculating exactly how many seconds it would take to hit the ground if our gondola suddenly broke free. The descent was somehow worse than going up, because now I could see exactly how high we'd been and watch the ground rushing toward us with what felt like dangerous speed. Every time we passed another gondola going up, I was convinced we were going to collide and send both cars spinning off into space. When we finally reached the bottom and the operator opened our safety bar, I practically leaped out of that gondola and onto solid ground. My legs felt shaky and unreliable, like they'd forgotten how to work properly during our time in the air. I stood there for a moment, just appreciating the feeling of stable earth beneath my feet. My dad asked if I'd enjoyed the ride, and I told him it was amazing because I didn't want to admit how terrified I'd been. But secretly, I was already planning never to set foot on a Ferris wheel again for the rest of my life. Some views, no matter how spectacular, just aren't worth the price of admission when you're afraid of heights. That story ends there, and poor Sophia learned the hard way that sometimes our courage is bigger than our stomach can handle. The image of her gripping that safety bar with white knuckles while trying to act brave for her dad is both hilarious and completely relatable. That moment when you realize you've committed to something that's way scarier than you expected is such a universal childhood experience. Our final story comes from Jacob, who discovered that the perfect reading atmosphere involves more than just a good book. The sound of rain on the window while I read. I was 9 years old and completely obsessed with this series about kids who could turn into animals. I'd check out every single book from our school library as soon as they became available, and I'd spend hours completely absorbed in these incredible adventures where ordinary teenagers could transform into hawks and tigers and dolphins. On this particular Saturday afternoon, I'd just gotten my hands on the newest book in the series and was planning to spend the entire day reading it from cover to cover. I'd set up my perfect reading spot in the living room, curled up in the corner of our big sectional couch with a pile of pillows arranged just right and a soft blanket pulled up to my chin. I was maybe 2 chapters in when I started hearing this gentle pattering sound against the windows. At first it was so soft I thought maybe it was just the neighbour's sprinkler system, but gradually it got louder and more rhythmic. When I looked up from my book, I could see raindrops starting to streak down the glass, creating these intricate patterns that caught the afternoon light. Instead of being disappointed that my plans for playing outside were getting rained out, I felt this incredible sense of contentment wash over me. There was something absolutely perfect about being warm and dry inside, while nature put on its own show just a few feet away. The sound of rain against the windows created this gentle white noise that seemed designed specifically for reading. As the rain picked up intensity, the sounds became more complex and layered. There was the steady drumming on the roof above me, the lighter tapping against the windows, and the occasional gurgling from the gutters as they channeled water away from the house. It was like being inside a natural symphony where every surface contributed its own percussion to the overall composition. I settled deeper into my reading spot and found that the rain sounds were creating the most incredible atmosphere for the story I was reading. The characters in my book were on this dangerous mission, trying to infiltrate an enemy base while staying in their animal forms, and the dramatic weather outside seemed to match the tension and excitement on the page perfectly. That story wraps up beautifully, and there's something so cozy about Jacob discovering that perfect reading environment where the weather outside makes the warmth inside feel even more special. The rain creating a natural soundtrack for his adventure story shows how childhood has this amazing ability to turn ordinary moments into something magical. Sometimes, the best reading experiences happen when the world outside matches the mood of whatever world you're exploring on the page. These memories we've shared tonight remind us that childhood magic wasn't found in expensive toys or elaborate vacations, but in those perfect little moments that cost absolutely nothing. Whether it was the scratch of chalk on concrete, the warmth of a baby chick in your palms, or the simple joy of jumping into a pile of leaves you'd spent all afternoon raking, these stories prove that the most vivid memories come from the simplest experiences. When we were young enough to find wonder in everything, and brave enough to believe that magic was hiding around every corner. Thanks for taking this trip down memory lane with me tonight. Consider subscribing for more if you haven't already, and I'll see you tomorrow. Take care.